early September, and every muscle in my legs screamed for rest. The Chihuahuan Desert stretched endlessly around me, a brutal landscape of creosote bushes, ocotillo and rust-colored rock formations that looked like ancient sentinels frozen in time. Most of my college friends had settled into mortgages and minivan payments by now, but here I was, taking a solo trip through one of the most isolated stretches of wilderness in New Mexico, trying to figure out what came next after leaving my nursing job in Albuquerque. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, and I needed to find a spot to pitch my tent before darkness swallowed everything. I had been hiking off trail for most of the day, deliberately avoiding the more popular routes because I craved solitude. The foothills rose around me like crumbling staircases, dotted with boulders the size of small cars. When I spotted a cluster of sandstone formations creating a natural alcove, I felt a wave of relief wash through my exhausted body. It was perfect, sheltered from wind, invisible from any direction unless someone walked right up to it. I set up my small two-person tent behind the largest rock, positioning it so the opening faced the stone wall, rather than the open desert. Privacy felt important out here, even though I had not seen another human being since leaving the trailhead that morning. The silence was absolute, the kind of quiet that city people never truly experience, where you can hear your own heartbeat pulsing in your ears. I ate a cold dinner of trail mix and beef jerky, watching the stars emerge one by one until the entire sky transformed into a glittering canvas. My phone showed no signal, which I expected. I had downloaded offline maps before the trip and told my sister Valerie I would check in when I reached the next town in 3 days. By 9:30, I had crawled into my sleeping bag, bone-tired and oddly peaceful. The desert air cooled rapidly after sunset, and I zipped the tent closed, listening to the gentle rustle of wind against nylon. Sleep came quickly, pulling me under like a warm current, and for a few hours, everything was exactly as I had hoped it would be. The sound ripped me from sleep like a hand yanking me out of water. Engines, loud, aggressive, unmistakably the high-pitched whine of ATVs tearing through the desert floor. My eyes snapped open in the pitch blackness of my tent, and I lay completely still, my breath trapped somewhere in my chest. The noise grew louder, echoing off the rock formations, bouncing around until it seemed to come from every direction at once. I fumbled for my phone and checked the time, 11:47. For a long moment, I convinced myself it was just recreational riders, maybe some locals who knew the terrain and liked to race through the desert at night. But something about the way the engines revved, stopping and starting in irregular bursts, made my skin prickle with unease. I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag, moving inch by inch to avoid making any sound. The engines cut off abruptly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I crept to the mesh window of my tent and peered out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the vague shapes of rocks and scrub brush under a sliver of moon. Then I noticed the lights, not headlights but handheld flashlights, 4 or 5 of them, bobbing about 300 yards to the east where the ground dipped into a shallow basin. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched the beams sweep back and forth across the dirt. I could make out silhouettes now, maybe 4 or 5 figures moving with purpose, their movements coordinated like they had done this before. One of them carried something long across his shoulders, a rifle or a shotgun. I could not tell which from this distance. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay hidden, to not move, to barely breathe. I pressed myself lower against the tent floor, watching through the tiny window, as the figures gathered in a loose circle around a specific spot on the ground. Then I heard the sound of metal striking earth, rhythmic and deliberate, and I realized with dawning horror that they were digging. The digging continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. I did not dare move from my position, barely allowing myself to blink as I watched the flashlight beams dance across the basin. My legs cramped from holding still, but the fear running through my veins kept me anchored in place. Eventually the shoveling stopped, and I heard voices carry across the still night air. Low, masculine, too distant to make out specific words but close enough to catch the tone. They sounded casual, almost businesslike. like men discussing a routine task rather than whatever nightmare I was witnessing. Two of the figures broke away from the group and walked back toward where I assumed the ATVs were parked, disappearing behind a ridge. When they returned, they were dragging something between them, something large and heavy wrapped in what looked like a blue plastic tarp. The shape was unmistakable, even from 300 yards away. I had seen enough bodies during my years in the emergency room to recognize the proportions, the way the weight distributed, the limpness of limbs beneath synthetic material. They rolled the tarp into the pit with a carelessness that made bile rise in my throat. One of the men said something, and another laughed, a short barking sound that echoed off the rocks and reached me with sickening clarity. I watched as they began shoveling dirt back into the hole, working quickly now, their flashlights occasionally sweeping wider arcs across the terrain. Every time a beam swung in my general direction, I pressed my face into the tent floor and held my breath until spots danced behind my eyelids. My phone sat useless in my pocket, no signal bars mocking me with their absence. I thought about all the true crime podcasts I had listened to during long shifts, all the stories of people who stumbled onto something they should not have seen and paid the price. The desert was vast, empty, unforgiving. If something happened to me out here, Valerie would not even know to worry for another 3 days. By then I could be buried in my own shallow pit, just another mystery that the sand would eventually swallow. The men finished their work and gathered their tools. I watched one of them pour something from a jug over the freshly turned earth. Water maybe, or something to mask a scent from animals. They stood around for a few more minutes, smoking cigarettes whose orange tips glowed like tiny demons in the darkness. Then, one by one, they mounted their ATVs. The engines roared back to life, shattering the silence, and the headlights flicked on in a blinding burst. I buried my face in my arms as the beams swept across the desert floor, certain that at any moment they would land on my tent and everything would be over. But the sound began to fade, moving away, heading south toward what I assumed was a road or a trail that connected to civilization. I waited until the noise dissolved completely into the night, until the only sound was my own ragged breathing and the frantic thudding of my pulse in my ears. Even then, I could not bring myself to move. I lay there in the darkness, trembling, replaying what I had seen over and over until the images burned themselves permanently into my brain. I must have stayed frozen in that position for at least an hour, maybe longer. Time had lost all meaning in the suffocating darkness of that tent. Eventually, the rational part of my brain began to reassert itself, pushing through the fog of terror with practical thoughts. I needed to get out of here. I needed to move, to put as many miles as possible between myself and that shallow grave before sunrise. If I left now and hiked through the night, I could reach the highway by mid-morning and flag down a car. I could call the police, report what I saw, let them handle it. Slowly, carefully, I began gathering my things, shoving my sleeping bag into my pack with hands that refused to stop shaking. I did not want to turn on my headlamp. The darkness felt like the only protection I had left, so I worked by touch alone, fingers fumbling with zippers and straps. When I finally had everything packed, I crept to the tent door and unzipped it just enough to slip outside. That was when I saw it, and the air left my lungs like I had been punched in the chest. A tire track. Fresh, deep, pressed into the soft desert sand no more than 6 inches from the edge of my tent. The tread pattern was thick and aggressive, the kind you see on off-road vehicles, and it curved around the rock formation in a deliberate arc before disappearing back toward the basin. They had come here. While I was hiding inside, paralyzed with fear, one of them had driven right up to my campsite, close enough to reach out and touch the nylon walls. Close enough to hear me breathing if I had made a single sound. I stared at that track in the pale moonlight, my mind refusing to process what it meant. They knew I was here. They had seen my tent, probably spotted it when their headlights swept across the rocks, and instead of confronting me, they had simply left. Why? The question gnawed at me as I stood there, exposed and vulnerable in the open air. Were they coming back? Were they watching me right now from somewhere in the darkness, waiting to see what I would do? The desert suddenly felt alive with invisible eyes, every shadow a potential threat, Every whisper of wind a footstep creeping closer. I did not have time to think. I did not have the luxury of fear. I grabbed my pack and started moving, heading north, away from the burial site, away from the tire track, away from everything. My legs moved on autopilot, carrying me across the uneven terrain while my eyes strained against the darkness. I could not use my headlamp. If they were watching, the light would make me an easy target. So I navigated by starlight alone, tripping over rocks and scrub brush, catching myself on my palms again and again. The skin on my hands tore open, but I barely felt it. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened, straining for the sound of engines or footsteps, but the desert remained silent. After what felt like hours, the eastern horizon began to lighten, shifting from black to deep purple to the first pale hints of orange. I had covered maybe 5 or 6 miles, pushing myself harder than I ever had in my life, and when I finally crested a ridge and saw a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through the valley below, I nearly collapsed with relief. The highway, civilization, safety, or at least the illusion of it. A trucker named Wallace picked me up around 7 in the morning. He was an older man with a gray beard and kind eyes, hauling agricultural equipment down to Las Cruces, and he did not ask too many questions when I stumbled out of the scrubland looking like I had crawled through hell. He let me use his phone to call 911, and I sat in the cab of his rig shaking so hard that I could barely hold the device steady while I described what I had witnessed. The dispatcher transferred me to the county sheriff's department, and a deputy met us at a gas station about 30 miles down the road. I told him everything: the ATVs, the flashlights, the men with the tarp, the shallow pit, the tire track inches from my tent. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, and when I finished, he asked me if I could lead them back to the location. The thought of returning to that place made me want to vomit, but I nodded anyway. Whatever was buried in that desert, whoever it was, they deserved to be found. They deserved justice, or at the very least, a proper grave. It took most of that day to organize a search team and navigate back to the basin where I had watched the men dig. I rode in a sheriff's SUV with 2 deputies, following coordinates I had marked on my offline map, and the entire drive felt like descending back into a nightmare. When we arrived, the afternoon sun was blazing overhead, turning the desert into a furnace of heat and light. The deputies fanned out with shovels and a cadaver dog, and within 20 minutes, the dog alerted on a patch of disturbed earth exactly where I said it would be. They dug carefully, methodically, and when the first corner of blue tarp emerged from the sand, one of the deputies looked at me with an expression I will never forget, a mixture of validation and horror, like he had hoped I was wrong but knew I was not. They found a body. A woman, the medical examiner later determined, probably in her early 40s, dead less than 48 hours. The case remains open to this day. They never caught the men responsible, never identified the victim, never explained why they left me alive when they clearly knew I was there. I have thought about that question every single day for the past 2 years. Sometimes I convince myself they did not see me at all, that the tire track was just a coincidence, a random pass during their sweep of the area. Other times, in the darker hours of the night when sleep refuses to come, I believe they made a deliberate choice. That killing a witness would have complicated things, drawn more attention, created another body to bury. Maybe I was more useful to them alive, a traumatized hiker whose story would sound too wild to believe, who had no real evidence beyond her own terrified eyes. I moved back east after that trip, took a nursing job in Pennsylvania, where the landscape is green and the horizons are short. I do not hike alone anymore. I do not camp in places where I cannot see who is coming from every direction. The desert took something from me that night, some fundamental sense of safety that I will never get back. But it also gave me something, the knowledge that I was strong enough to survive, smart enough to stay silent when silence was all that stood between me and a shallow grave. Whoever that woman was, I hope she has found peace. I hope someone, somewhere, is still looking for her. And I hope that the men who buried her in that basin are looking over their shoulders every single day, wondering if the witness they left alive will be the reason their world comes crashing down. After my divorce got finalized in April 2015, I made a decision that most people in my life thought was either brave or completely stupid. I quit my accounting job at a firm in Baltimore where I had spent 9 miserable years, sold most of my furniture, and decided to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail alone. My therapist called it running away from your problems with extra steps, which made me laugh for the first time in months. At 34, with no kids, no mortgage anymore, and a decent chunk of savings, I figured if there was ever a time to disappear into the woods for a few weeks, this was it. I had done some camping before, nothing too extreme, mostly weekend trips with college buddies back when we were young, and thought sleeping on rocks was fun. But solo backpacking through remote Appalachia was different. I knew that going in, or at least I thought I did. I had been on the trail for about 6 days when I reached a ridge that my map labeled as Creighton's Bluff, somewhere in the backcountry of Western Virginia. The spot was perfect for camping, a flat clearing about 30 feet from a steep drop-off that overlooked a valley thick with old-growth forest. No other hikers had passed me in almost 2 days, which was exactly what I wanted. Cell service had died sometime around day 3, and I had made peace with being completely disconnected. That Wednesday evening, I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and cooked some dehydrated chili that tasted like cardboard mixed with regret. The sun dropped behind the mountains around 8, painting everything in shades of orange and purple that made me feel, for a moment, like maybe this whole trip was not such a crazy idea after all. I remember sitting there, watching the valley below fade into shadow, feeling genuinely calm for the first time since my ex-wife told me she had been seeing someone else. That calm would not last through the night. It started around 10:30, maybe 11. I was lying in my tent, not quite asleep, but drifting in that hazy space between awake and dreaming, when I heard the first rock, a sharp crack echoing up from the valley below, the unmistakable sound of stone hitting stone. I did not think much of it at first. Rocks fall, animals knock things loose, the mountains are alive with small noises at night. But then I heard another one, and another, and they were not random. There was a rhythm to them, a deliberate pattern, like someone was throwing rocks off a ledge at steady intervals. One every 8 or 10 seconds, each impact ringing through the darkness like a slow, patient drumbeat. I unzipped my tent and crawled out into the cold night air, my breath misting in front of my face. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see my own boots. I stood at the edge of the clearing and stared down into the valley. But there was nothing to see, just blackness, thick and absolute, swallowing everything below the ridgeline. The rocks kept falling. I counted them. 14, 15, 16, each one landing somewhere far below with that same sharp crack. It sounded like they were being thrown from somewhere to my left, maybe a quarter mile along the ridge, but I could not see any light or movement in that direction. No flashlight beam, no campfire glow, nothing to suggest another hiker was out there in the dark. I told myself it was probably some animal, maybe a bear knocking stones loose while foraging, or a rock slide that just happened to have a weirdly consistent pace. But I had spent enough time in the woods to know what natural sounds felt like, and this did not feel natural. This felt intentional, purposeful, like someone was sending a message across the darkness, and I just could not understand what it meant. After about 20 minutes, the rocks stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I climbed back into my tent, zipped it tight, and lay there with my eyes wide open, listening to my own heartbeat pound against the ground beneath me. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I remember is snapping awake to complete silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, like the forest itself is holding its breath. My watch said it was 1:47 in the morning. I lay still for a long moment, trying to figure out what had woken me, and then I saw it, a faint glow moving through the trees in the valley below. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that maybe I was still half asleep and imagining things. But the light was real. It was dim and yellowish like an old lantern or a candle behind dirty glass, and it was weaving between the trees maybe half a mile down the slope. I grabbed my binoculars from my pack and pressed them to my face, trying to get a better look. The light bobbed and swayed as it moved, disappearing behind tree trunks and reappearing a few seconds later, heading in a direction that made no sense. There was no trail down there. I had studied my map carefully before setting up camp, and that part of the valley was unmarked wilderness, nothing but dense forest and rough terrain for miles. Then I saw another light. This one appeared further to the right, maybe 200 yards from the first, moving in a parallel path through the darkness. And then a third, even further out, barely visible through the canopy. 3 lights, all moving at roughly the same pace, all heading in the same general direction, like some kind of silent procession through the woods. I watched them for almost 15 minutes. My binoculars pressed so hard against my face that they left marks on my skin. The lights never flickered like flashlights would. They never swept back and forth like someone searching for a trail. They just drifted steadily forward, smooth and purposeful, weaving between obstacles I could not see. I tried to convince myself it was other hikers, maybe a group doing some kind of night trek, but nothing about the way those lights moved suggested normal hiking. Normal hikers stumble. Normal hikers stop to check their footing. These lights glided through the forest like they knew exactly where they were going, like they had walked that path 1,000 times before in the dark. Around 2:15, the lights changed direction, all 3 of them, almost simultaneously, like they had received some signal I could not hear. They stopped their forward movement and began angling upward toward the ridge, toward me. I lowered the binoculars and felt my chest tighten. It could have been a coincidence. The ridge was a natural landmark, and if those people were heading somewhere specific, following the high ground would make sense. But the timing felt wrong. They had been moving parallel to the ridge for 15 minutes, and now suddenly, they were climbing. I sat there in the darkness watching those 3 dim lights slowly ascend the slope, and I tried to calculate how long it would take them to reach the top. An hour maybe. Maybe less if they knew the terrain well. I thought about packing up and leaving, but hiking alone at night on a trail I barely knew seemed like a good way to twist an ankle or walk off a cliff. So I stayed. I told myself I was being paranoid, that those lights were probably just locals out hunting or checking traps or doing whatever people did in these mountains after dark. I told myself a lot of things that night. None of them made me feel any better. By 3 in the morning, the lights had disappeared. I had lost sight of them about 40 minutes earlier, when they dropped below the tree line on their way up the slope. I kept expecting to see them emerge from the forest at the edge of my clearing, to hear voices or footsteps approaching through the brush, but nothing came. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. I sat with my back against a tree, facing the direction the lights had been coming from, my headlamp off and my knife in my hand. It was a folding blade, nothing impressive, but holding it made me feel slightly less helpless. The fire had gone completely cold by then, just a circle of gray ash that offered no warmth and no light. I thought about relighting it, but something told me not to. Something told me that right now, in this moment, being visible was not a good idea. So I sat in the dark and I waited, my ears straining for any sound that did not belong. The mountains around me felt different than they had during the day, older somehow, hostile, like I had wandered into a place where I was not supposed to be, and something out there knew it. I do not know when I fell asleep. I did not mean to. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to stay alert, but exhaustion must have won eventually. One moment I was staring into the darkness with my knife clutched against my chest, and the next I was blinking awake to pale gray light filtering through the trees. Dawn. I had made it to dawn. My neck ached from sleeping upright against the tree, and my fingers were stiff from gripping the knife handle for hours. I sat there for a moment, letting the relief wash over me, listening to the first birds beginning to call in the canopy above. In the daylight, everything seemed almost normal again. The valley below was just a valley, green and quiet and unthreatening. The ridge was just a ridge. I let out a long breath and started to push myself up from the ground, already thinking about packing up my gear and putting as many miles as possible between me and this place. That is when I noticed the footprints. They were about 8 feet from where I had been sitting, pressed into the soft dirt near the remains of my campfire. I walked over slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. The prints were bare feet. No boots, no shoes, just the clear impression of naked soles and toes pressed into the earth. They were wide, wider than my own feet by a good margin, and the toes were splayed apart in a way that looked almost unnatural, like whoever made them was used to walking without footwear. I crouched down and studied them, my heart hammering against my ribs. There were at least a dozen prints, overlapping in places, circling the dead fire in a slow, deliberate pattern. Whoever had made them had walked around my campsite while I slept. They had stood right there, right next to the ashes, close enough to touch my tent if they had reached out. I followed the tracks with my eyes, tracing their path around the fire pit, and felt something cold settle into my stomach when I saw where they led. The prints came right up to the base of the tree I had been leaning against. They stopped maybe 6 inches from where my legs had been stretched out in the dirt. Someone had stood over me in the darkness, barefoot and silent, watching me sleep. And I had not heard a thing. I packed my gear in under 5 minutes. I did not bother with breakfast, did not bother folding my tent properly, did not bother with any of the careful routines I had developed over the past week on the trail. I just shoved everything into my pack with shaking hands and started moving. The footprints led away from my campsite toward the eastern edge of the ridge, disappearing into a dense thicket of rhododendron that I had no intention of following. I went the opposite direction, back toward the main trail, walking as fast as I could without breaking into a full run. Every few minutes I would stop and listen, scanning the trees around me for any sign of movement. The forest was quiet except for the birds and the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt. Too quiet, maybe. I kept thinking about those wide, splayed toes pressed into the earth, about how close they had been to my body while I slept. I kept thinking about the lights in the valley, moving in perfect coordination through the darkness. And I kept thinking about the rocks, that steady rhythm echoing across the mountains like a signal. A signal to whom? A signal for what? I did not want to know the answer. I just wanted to get out of there. I hiked for nearly 7 hours straight, barely stopping except to drink water and check my map. By late afternoon, I had reached a small town called Bradshaw's Crossing. Nothing more than a gas station, a general store, and a cluster of old houses scattered along a 2-lane road. I must have looked like a wreck when I walked into that store. Dirty, exhausted, wild-eyed, because the old woman behind the counter took one look at me and asked if I was all right. I told her I had been camping up on Creighton's Bluff and had a rough night. She got quiet for a moment, her face doing something complicated that I could not quite read. Then she said, real casual, that most folks around here knew better than to camp up on that ridge. Said there were people who lived back in those hollows, families that had been there for generations, who did not take kindly to outsiders on what they considered their land. She did not say anything else, did not elaborate, just handed me my change and wished me safe travels with a look in her eyes that told me I was lucky to be standing there at all. I drove home the next day, sold my camping gear a week later. I have not been back to Appalachia since, and I do not plan to ever go again. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that rhythm in my head. Rock after rock after rock, falling into the darkness like a countdown to something I was never meant to see. My college roommate, Brianna, had been planning this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a celebration. All 5 of us had just survived our junior year finals, and we were desperate to decompress before summer internships scattered us across different states. The group was me, Brianna, our friend Chloe from the photography club, and 2 guys from our study group, Austin and Wesley. Brianna and I had shared a dorm since freshman year, which means I was 21 that spring. Still young enough to believe that bad things only happened to people who made bad decisions. I had known Austin since orientation week, and he had always been a little intense, but in a way that seemed harmless back then. He was the kind of guy who would text you 17 times if you did not respond within an hour, who remembered every detail of every conversation you ever had with him. Brianna used to joke that he would make someone a very attentive boyfriend someday. None of us were laughing by the end of that weekend. We drove up to Blackwood Ridge in Austin's pickup truck on a Friday afternoon. The campsite was about 4 hours from campus, deep in a national forest that Brianna had discovered through some hiking forum online. She had printed out maps, packed enough supplies for a week even though we were only staying 2 nights, and created a whole itinerary of trails and lookout points she wanted us to visit. The drive up was normal enough. We played music, passed around bags of chips and gummy worms, talked about professors we hated and classes we were dreading in the fall. Austin was quieter than usual, spending most of the ride staring out the window at the passing trees. I figured he was just exhausted from finals like the rest of us. When we finally pulled off the main road onto the dirt path leading to our campsite, the sun was already starting to dip below the tree line. The forest closed around us like a fist, branches scraping against the windows as if trying to get in. I remember thinking how isolated we were, how far from everything. At the time, it felt like freedom. We set up camp in a clearing about half a mile from where we parked. Wesley and Brianna handled the tents while Chloe gathered kindling for the fire pit. Austin immediately started giving directions, even though nobody had asked him to be in charge. He told Wesley the tent stakes were going in at the wrong angle. He told Brianna the rainfly was inside out. He walked over to where Chloe was collecting sticks and started sorting through her pile, tossing aside the ones he deemed too damp or too thin. I watched him from across the clearing, and something about the way he moved struck me as odd. There was a nervous energy to him, a tightness in his shoulders that had not been there during the drive. When I asked if he was okay, he turned to me with this strange look, not angry, not sad, just empty somehow, and said he was fine. Then he smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Brianna caught my gaze and shrugged, mouthing the word finals, as if that explained everything. I wanted to believe her. That first night around the campfire should have been perfect. The sky was clear, filled with more stars than I had ever seen living in the city, and Chloe had brought her portable speaker so we could listen to music while we roasted marshmallows. But Austin kept steering the conversation in uncomfortable directions. He brought up a party from sophomore year where Brianna had gotten too drunk and needed someone to walk her home. He had been that someone, and he made sure we all remembered it. He mentioned the time he had helped Chloe edit her photography portfolio at 2 in the morning before a submission deadline. He talked about lending Wesley money for textbooks, about driving me to the pharmacy when I had the flu last winter. Every story was technically true, but the way he told them made it sound like we all owed him something. Wesley tried to change the subject a few times, but Austin kept circling back. By the time we crawled into our tents around midnight, the mood had shifted. The easy laughter from the car ride felt like it belonged to a different trip entirely. I woke up Saturday morning to the sound of arguing. The sun was barely up, pale light filtering through the tent fabric, and I could hear Austin's voice outside, low and insistent. I unzipped the flap just enough to see him standing with Chloe near the edge of the clearing. She had her arms crossed tight against her chest, and even from 20 feet away I could tell she was upset. Austin was leaning toward her, one hand gesturing toward the woods, the other gripping her elbow. When Chloe tried to pull away, he held on for just a second too long before letting go. She walked back toward the tents without looking at him, her face pale. I pretended to be asleep when she climbed back into the tent she shared with Brianna. Later, when I asked what happened, Chloe said Austin had wanted her to go on an early morning hike with him, just the two of them. When she said no, he had gotten weird about it. She used that exact word, weird, not angry, not aggressive, just weird. Like he could not understand why she would possibly refuse. Like the concept of someone saying no to him did not compute. Brianna suggested we all stick together for the rest of the trip, and we agreed. But Austin acted like nothing had happened. The rest of the morning, Austin kept finding reasons to separate us. He asked Wesley to help him gather firewood on the opposite side of the camp, then spent 40 minutes walking him deeper and deeper into the trees until Wesley finally insisted they head back. He told Brianna there was an amazing view just 10 minutes down a trail, and when she said she would rather wait for the group, he sulked for an hour. He kept appearing beside me whenever I wandered even a few feet from the others, materializing silently like he had been watching and waiting for the moment I was alone. Each time he would say something casual. "Nice morning. Did you sleep okay? Want to check out that stream I found?" But his eyes tracked my movements with an intensity that made my skin prickle. By noon, we had all noticed the pattern. Wesley pulled me aside while Austin was in his tent and whispered that something was seriously wrong. He said Austin had been talking during their firewood walk about how none of us appreciated him, how he did everything for this group and got nothing in return. Wesley's hands were trembling when he told me. He wanted to leave. We all did. But Austin had the only car, and he had the keys in his pocket. We tried to act normal for the rest of the afternoon, but the tension was suffocating. Every conversation felt like walking through a minefield. Austin would join in, say something that seemed friendly enough on the surface, and then add a little comment that landed like a slap. When Brianna mentioned she was excited about her summer internship in Boston, Austin said it was funny how she always managed to land on her feet, unlike some people who actually had to work for things. When Chloe took photos of the creek, Austin asked if she ever got tired of hiding behind a camera instead of actually connecting with people. Each remark was delivered with a smile, in a tone that made you question whether you had heard it right. Brianna kept shooting me glances that screamed, "We need to talk," but there was never a moment when Austin was not hovering nearby. Around 4 in the afternoon, Chloe announced she was going to take a nap in her tent. Brianna said she would join her. Wesley suddenly remembered he had a headache and retreated to the tent he shared with Austin. I started to follow Brianna, desperate to regroup and figure out a plan, but Austin stepped directly into my path. He told me he needed to talk to me about something important. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it that made every instinct in my body scream to run. I said I was tired too, that we could talk later, but he shook his head slowly. He said this could not wait. He said he had found something in the woods earlier that morning, something bad. A hiker, he said, about a mile down the eastern trail. She had fallen and hurt her leg, could not walk, and was alone out there with no cell service and no way to get help. He said he had been waiting all day to tell someone, but did not want to scare the group. He said the woman was in real pain, and we needed to help her right now. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, and he reached out to take my hand. He said the others would slow us down, that we needed to move fast, just the two of us. Something about the way he said it, just the two of us, made my heart start pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told him we should get Wesley. Austin's face flickered. Just for a fraction of a second, something dark passed behind his eyes before the mask slipped back into place. He said Wesley would only slow us down, that the woman needed help now and we were wasting precious time. I told him we should at least tell Brianna where we were going in case something happened. Austin's grip on my hand tightened, and he said there was no time, that every second we stood here arguing was a second that poor woman was suffering alone in the woods. His voice cracked on the word suffering, like he was genuinely upset, and for a moment I almost believed him. Almost. But then I remembered something. That morning, when I had woken up to Austin and Chloe arguing, the sun had barely risen. Austin claimed he found this injured hiker during an early morning walk, but he had been with Chloe at dawn, trying to convince her to go hiking with him. He had not gone anywhere alone. There was no injured hiker. There never had been. The realization hit me like ice water, and I yanked my hand away from his so hard I stumbled backward. I said I needed to use the bathroom first. I said I would be right back, just give me 2 minutes and then we could go. Austin stared at me for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wanted to spit out. I kept my face blank, kept my voice steady, even though every nerve in my body was on fire. Finally, he nodded. He said he would wait right here, that I should hurry. I walked toward the tree line as calmly as I could manage, feeling his eyes burning into my back with every step. The moment I was out of his direct line of sight, I ran. I ran straight to Brianna's tent and threw open the flap, not caring about being quiet anymore. Brianna and Chloe both sat up, startled, and I told them everything in a frantic whisper. The injured hiker that did not exist. The way Austin had been trying to get me alone. The lie that unraveled the second I thought about the timeline. Chloe's face went white. Brianna grabbed my arm and pulled me inside the tent, zipping it shut behind me. Through the thin fabric walls, we could hear Austin calling my name. His voice was still calm, still friendly. That was somehow the worst part. Wesley heard the commotion and crawled out of his tent, asking what was going on. Austin intercepted him before he could reach us, and through the tent fabric I could hear Austin explaining that I had gotten upset over nothing, that I was being dramatic, that he was just trying to help someone in need and I had freaked out for no reason. His voice was so reasonable, so measured, that for a split second I wondered if I had made a mistake. But then Brianna squeezed my hand and whispered that we needed to get those keys. Chloe had her phone out, desperately searching for a signal, even though we all knew there was none this deep in the forest. We heard Wesley's voice rise. He was arguing with Austin, demanding to know what was really going on. Then there was a scuffle, the sound of someone hitting the ground, and Wesley shouted for us to run. Brianna unzipped the back of the tent, the side facing away from the campsite, and the three of us crawled out into the underbrush. We ran toward the trail that led back to the parking area, branches whipping our faces and arms, not daring to look back. I could hear Austin crashing through the woods behind us, calling our names in that same calm voice, telling us we were overreacting, telling us to stop and just talk to him. We made it to the dirt road where the truck was parked, but without the keys we could not drive. Brianna remembered passing a ranger station about 2 miles back on the main road, and we started running again. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like they might give out. But I did not stop. None of us did. We reached the ranger station just as the sun was starting to set, and the woman behind the desk took one look at our faces and immediately picked up her radio. 2 rangers drove us back to the campsite in their vehicle. When we got there, Austin was sitting calmly by the fire pit, roasting a marshmallow like nothing had happened. Wesley was in his tent with a bloody nose and a bruise forming under his left eye. Austin tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, that we had panicked over a joke, but the rangers were not buying it. They escorted us to our cars. One ranger drove Austin's truck with Austin in the passenger seat, while the other followed with the rest of us. We filed a report at the local police station that night. Austin was not arrested, but there was a record now, a paper trail. We never spoke to him again after that weekend. I heard through mutual friends that he transferred schools the following semester. Sometimes I still think about that moment in the clearing, when he took my hand and asked me to follow him into the woods. I think about what might have happened if I had not remembered that he was with Chloe that morning. If I had believed him, if I had gone. Camping alone seemed like a good idea when I planned it back in January. My sister had just gotten married. Most of my college buddies were having their second or third kids. And here I was, same apartment since graduation in 2012, same job at the warehouse, same routine that felt more like a slow death than a life. I needed something that would remind me I was still breathing, still capable of doing things on my own terms. So I picked a spot in the Ozarks, about 4 hours from my place in Kansas City. Deep enough into the woods that cell service became a distant memory. The campsite was technically off the grid. No designated spots, no rangers checking in, just me and whatever wildlife decided to tolerate my presence. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in early October, the kind of day where the leaves were turning burnt orange and the air had that crisp bite that makes you feel genuinely alive. I set up my tent about 30 yards from an old logging road that looked like it had not seen regular traffic in years, maybe decades. Overgrown with weeds, rutted with erosion, it seemed like the perfect backdrop for the solitude I was craving. That first day went exactly how I had imagined it would. I spent the afternoon hiking a trail I found on an old forestry map. Nothing too strenuous, just enough to work up a sweat and clear my head. The forest was dense with oak and hickory, and every now and then I would catch a glimpse of deer watching me from between the trees before bounding off into the underbrush. I cooked dinner over a small fire as the sun went down. Just canned chili and some bread I had packed. Nothing fancy, but it tasted incredible out there in the middle of nowhere. By 9 that evening, I was in my tent with a paperback I had been meaning to read for months, a flashlight propped against my backpack, and the sounds of the forest settling in around me. Owls hooting somewhere in the distance, branches creaking in the wind, the occasional rustle of something small moving through the fallen leaves. I fell asleep around 10, feeling more at peace than I had in months, completely unaware that in a few hours, that peace would shatter into something I still have nightmares about. The sound that woke me was not loud, but it was wrong. Out here, you get used to the natural rhythm of the forest pretty quick. Animals moving through brush, wind pushing through branches, the occasional crack of a dead limb falling somewhere in the darkness. But this was different. This was mechanical. A low rumble that grew steadily louder, the unmistakable groan of engines working hard against rough terrain. I lay there in my sleeping bag, eyes open, heart starting to pick up speed, telling myself it was probably just some hunters using the old logging road as a shortcut. People did that sometimes, right? Used abandoned roads to get deeper into hunting grounds. But something in my gut was telling me to stay quiet, stay still. Do not move until you know what you are dealing with. I checked my phone out of habit. 3:14 in the morning, no signal, battery at 62%. The engine noise grew louder and then multiplied. Not one vehicle, two. I heard them stop maybe 50 yards from my position, engines idling for a moment before cutting off completely. Doors opened and closed, not slammed but pushed shut carefully, deliberately, the way someone closes a door when they do not want to make noise. I could hear voices now, low and indistinct, the kind of murmuring that happens when people are trying not to be heard. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay exactly where I was, but I needed to see what was happening. I unzipped my sleeping bag as slowly as humanly possible, each tooth of the zipper sounding like a gunshot in the silence of my tent. I crawled toward the mesh window on the side facing the road, keeping my body as flat as I could against the ground. The moon was about 3/4 full that night, bright enough to cast shadows, and when I pressed my face against the mesh, I could see them, 2 pickup trucks, both dark-colored, parked nose to nose on the logging road. And around them, moving with purpose, at least 5 men. They were unloading something from the bed of the first truck, rectangular bundles wrapped tight in what looked like black plastic or maybe heavy-duty trash bags, each one about the size of a large duffel bag. The men worked in near silence, passing the bundles from one to another in a chain, stacking them on the ground between the 2 vehicles. I counted the packages as they moved them, 8, 9, 10, 12 total. One of the men said something I could not make out, and another one responded with a harsh whisper that carried just enough for me to catch the tone. Angry, impatient. These were not hunters, these were not hikers who got lost. I had stumbled into something I was never supposed to see, and the realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. I pressed myself even flatter against the floor of my tent, trying to make myself as small as possible, barely breathing. The arguing got louder. I could make out fragments now, something about a count being wrong, about someone named Ray who had screwed something up. One of the men, taller than the others with broad shoulders and a baseball cap, stepped away from the group and pulled out a flashlight. He clicked it on and swept the beam across the tree line, slow and deliberate, like he was looking for something specific. The light passed within 10 feet of my tent, and I swear my heart stopped beating for a full second. Then the beam swung back toward the road, and the tall man froze. He was staring at the ground near the edge of the logging road, right where the overgrown grass met the dirt. I knew instantly what he was looking at. My boot prints. The ones I had left that afternoon when I crossed the road during my hike. The ones I had not even thought twice about because who would ever see them out here in the middle of nowhere? The tall man called out to the others, his voice low but urgent. I watched as 3 of them gathered around him, flashlights clicking on one by one. All of them aimed at the ground where my tracks disappeared into the tree line, toward me. One of them pulled something from his waistband, a handgun, black and angular in the moonlight, and held it down by his side. Another one had what looked like a shotgun, the barrel catching the light as he shifted it from one hand to the other. They talked among themselves for maybe 30 seconds, their voices too quiet for me to make out the words, but their body language told me everything I needed to know. They were going to search, they were going to find me. I had maybe 2 minutes, maybe less, before one of those flashlight beams landed on my green two-person tent, and everything I had ever worried about in my life became completely irrelevant. I had to make a choice, and I had to make it fast. Running was not an option. The forest floor was covered in dry leaves and fallen branches, and I would sound like a stampeding elephant the moment I tried to move. Staying in the tent was suicide. They would find it. They would find me inside it, and whatever happened after that would not end with them politely asking me to forget what I saw. My eyes landed on a fallen oak about 15 feet from my tent, a massive trunk that had come down sometime in the last year, its root system torn up and creating a dark, hollow space beneath where it had lifted the earth. I had noticed it when I was setting up camp, thought about how it would make decent shelter if my tent failed. Now it might be the only thing that kept me alive. I grabbed my phone and my knife, the only things within reach that mattered, and I started crawling toward the back of my tent, toward the zipper that faced away from the road. Every inch felt like a mile. Every rustle of my clothing against the tent floor sounded like a scream. I got the back zipper open just enough to squeeze through, and I slithered out onto the cold ground like some kind of desperate animal. The fallen oak was right there, a dark mass against the slightly lighter darkness of the forest. I could hear the men entering the tree line now, maybe 40 feet behind me, their footsteps crunching through the leaves with no attempt at stealth. They were not trying to be quiet anymore. They knew someone was out here and they were coming to find them. I crawled on my belly toward the root hollow, feeling rocks and twigs dig into my chest and stomach, biting down on my lip so hard I tasted copper. The hollow was smaller than I remembered, barely big enough for a grown man to fit inside, but I wedged myself into it anyway. I pulled dead leaves over my legs, pressed my face into the dirt, and I waited. The smell of damp earth and rotting wood filled my nostrils. Somewhere above me, an owl took flight, its wings cutting through the air with a sound like shuffled paper. The flashlight beams found my tent about 30 seconds later. I heard one of them curse, a sharp, surprised sound that cut through the quiet, and then they were all talking at once, their voices overlapping in urgent bursts. Someone said, "Check inside," and I heard the unmistakable sound of my tent being ripped open, the fabric tearing like it was made of tissue paper. They were maybe 20 feet from where I lay hidden, close enough that I could hear them breathing, close enough that if one of them decided to sweep that flashlight beam just a little to the left, just a little lower, they would see me. I pressed myself deeper into the hollow, feeling the roots dig into my back, feeling something crawl across my hand that I refused to think about. One of the men was going through my belongings now. I could hear him tossing things aside, my backpack hitting the ground, my sleeping bag being shaken out. Then a voice, clearer than the others, said something that made me dig my fingernails into the dirt. Whoever was here left in a hurry. They could still be close, spread out. The next 15 minutes were the longest of my entire life. I lay there in that hollow, not moving, barely breathing, while flashlight beams swept through the trees around me. At one point, a pair of boots stopped less than 5 feet from my hiding spot. I could see them through a gap in the roots, brown work boots caked with mud, standing right there on the other side of the fallen trunk. The man was breathing hard, annoyed, muttering something under his breath about wasting time. I watched those boots pivot slowly, the flashlight beam passing directly over the trunk above my head, and I made a deal with whatever God might be listening. If I survived this night, I would never take another moment of my ordinary, boring life for granted. The boots turned and walked away, crunching through the leaves toward the road, and I finally let myself take a full breath. But I did not move. I did not make a sound. I stayed exactly where I was, buried in the dirt like a corpse, waiting. Eventually, I heard them gathering back by the trucks. The tall man was giving orders, his voice carrying through the still night air. They were going to finish what they came here to do and get out. If whoever was camping here had run off into the woods, they were probably miles away by now, not worth chasing in the dark. I heard the bundles being loaded into the second truck, heard doors slamming shut with less care than before, heard engines starting up and tires grinding against the rutted road. The sound of those trucks fading into the distance was the sweetest thing I had ever heard. But still, I did not move. I lay in that hollow for another hour, maybe two, until the first gray light of dawn started filtering through the trees. Only then did I crawl out, covered in dirt and dead leaves and something sticky I did not want to identify. My tent was destroyed. My backpack had been dumped out and scattered, but I was alive. I was alive and they were gone, and none of it felt real. I gathered what I could salvage and hiked out of those woods faster than I have ever moved in my life. It took me almost 3 hours to reach my car, parked at a trailhead off the main highway, and another 40 minutes of driving before my phone finally picked up a signal. I pulled over at the first gas station I saw and called the police. The deputy who took my statement was a woman named Torres, mid-50s with tired eyes and a voice that suggested she had heard a lot of strange stories over the years. She listened without interrupting, wrote everything down and told me she would pass it along to the county sheriff and the DEA field office. She also told me, in that careful way cops have when they are trying not to scare you, that I should probably stay with family for a while, just in case. I did not ask her to explain what she meant by that. I did not need her to. I drove straight to my sister's place in Springfield and did not go back to my apartment for 2 weeks. I never heard anything official about what happened that night. No arrests made the news, no drug busts in the Ozarks that matched what I saw. Torres called me once, about a month later, to tell me the investigation was ongoing but that I should not expect any updates. She thanked me for coming forward and reminded me again to be careful. That was it. Sometimes I wonder if those men ever figured out who I was, if they went back to that campsite and found something I left behind, some piece of identification I did not think to grab in my panic. Sometimes I lie awake at night and imagine a dark pickup truck parked outside my building, engine idling, waiting. But it has been almost 2 years now, and nothing has happened. I still go camping, not alone anymore and never anywhere remote. I stick to established campgrounds with rangers and other families and cell service. I traded solitude for safety, and I have made my peace with that. But every now and then, when I am lying in my tent and I hear an engine in the distance, my whole body goes rigid, and I am right back in that hollow, pressing my face into the dirt, praying those boots do not come any closer. Most of my coworkers thought solo backpacking was reckless for a woman, and they never missed a chance to remind me. But by the spring of 2014, I had stopped caring what anyone thought. My marriage had crumbled 6 months earlier. My friends from nursing school were all wrapped up in toddlers and PTA meetings. And somewhere around my 34th birthday, I realized that the loneliness I felt in crowded rooms was worse than any solitude the wilderness could offer. Oregon became my refuge, the Cascade Range specifically, where the Douglas firs grow so thick they block out the sky, and the silence is so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. I had planned this particular trip for weeks, a 4-day solo trek into a section of backcountry that most day hikers never reached. My younger sister Megan called me the night before I left, her voice tight with worry, listing every news story she could find about women who vanished on trails. I promised her I would check in at every trailhead, that I had my satellite beacon, that I knew what I was doing. She did not sound convinced. The first 2 days unfolded like a meditation. I covered about 14 miles each day, my boots finding rhythm on the packed earth, stopping only to filter water from streams so clear you could count every pebble on the bottom. The burn in my calves and shoulders felt earned, purposeful, nothing like the hollow exhaustion of crying myself to sleep in an empty apartment. By the third evening, I had pushed deep into the backcountry, reaching a small clearing roughly 7 miles from the nearest marked trailhead. I found the spot through a backpacking form, one of those hidden gems that experienced hikers whisper about, but never post coordinates for. It was perfect. Level ground for my tent, a creek babbling maybe 30 feet away, surrounded by forest so dense it felt like a fortress. I made camp while the light was still golden, hung my food bag from a high branch, and crawled into my sleeping bag with that particular peace that only comes from physical exhaustion and total isolation. I remember zipping the tent closed and thinking, finally, Finally, I can breathe. I woke to darkness and the sound of the zipper. Not a fast sound, not the careless tug of wind against fabric. This was slow, deliberate, a centimeter at a time, the metal teeth separating with a soft purr that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. My eyes snapped open and I lay there, every muscle locked, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was hearing. The zipper stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. Footsteps, breathing, the rustle of clothing. Nothing. Just the creak in the distance and the blood pounding in my ears. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon investigating the tent, maybe the fabric had settled in the cooling night air. But I had camped dozens of times, and I knew what wind sounded like against nylon. This was not wind. This was someone testing how quietly the zipper could be opened, someone checking whether I would wake. I do not know how long I lay there. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe 5 minutes. Time becomes strange when your body floods with adrenaline, and your brain is screaming at you to move, but your limbs refuse to cooperate. I thought about the pepper spray in the side pocket of my pack, about the small knife I kept clipped to my belt, about the satellite beacon that was supposed to be my lifeline. All of it was useless if I could not make myself move. When the zipper sound did not return, I forced myself to sit up, my sleeping bag rustling so loudly it made me wince. I grabbed my headlamp from the mesh pocket near my head and held it like a weapon, my thumb hovering over the power button. I counted to 10, then to 20, giving whoever, whatever, was outside time to leave. Then I took the deepest breath of my life, unzipped the tent flap in one fast motion, and burst out into the night with the headlamp blazing. Nothing. The beam cut through the darkness and found only trees, their trunks pale and ghostly in the white light. I spun in a circle, my heart slamming against my ribs, searching for movement, for the shape of a person, for anything that would confirm I was not losing my mind. The clearing was empty. The forest stood silent and indifferent around me, the creek still murmuring its endless song somewhere to my left. I stood there in my thermal underwear and wool socks, the cold mountain air biting at my exposed skin, and I almost laughed. Almost convinced myself that I had dreamed the whole thing, that the stress of the past months had finally cracked something loose in my brain. Then I turned back toward my tent and saw my hiking poles. I had planted them in the ground beside the tent vestibule before bed, crossed in an X the way I always did, so I could find them easily in the morning. Now they were lying flat on the ground, parallel to each other, positioned almost neatly about 3 feet from where I had left them. The air left my lungs like I had been punched. I swept the headlamp beam across my campsite, forcing myself to really look at everything. My backpack was leaning against a tree where I had left it, but the main compartment buckles were undone. I always fastened them. It was habit, muscle memory from years of keeping my gear secure. I walked toward it on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. And when I got close, I could see that the top flap had been lifted, the contents slightly rearranged. My first aid kit was on top now, though I distinctly remembered packing it beneath my rain jacket. Someone had been going through my things while I slept, and they had been quiet enough that I only woke when they started on the tent. The thought made my throat close up. How long had they been there? How close had they gotten before I heard the zipper? I backed away from the pack, my headlamp swinging wildly as I scanned the tree line, suddenly certain that whoever had done this was still watching me from somewhere in that wall of darkness. I do not know what made me look down. Maybe instinct, maybe some part of my brain that understood what I needed to see before the rest of me caught up. But I angled my headlamp toward the ground around my tent, and that is when I saw the boot prints. They were clear in the soft earth, pressed deep by someone heavier than me, the treads thick and wide. A man's hiking boot, size 11 or 12 at least. The prints circled my tent in a complete loop, then circled again, 2 full rotations around the place where I'd been sleeping. I followed them with the beam of my light, my breath coming in shallow gasps, tracing the path this person had walked while I lay unconscious just a few feet away. The prints did not approach the tent from the trail. They came from deeper in the forest, from a direction where there was no path, no reason for anyone to be walking. Whoever this was had not stumbled upon my camp by accident. They had come through the woods deliberately, found me in a spot that was not on any map, and circled my tent like a predator studying its prey. The boot prints stopped at the back of the tent. Not the entrance, not the vestibule, the back, directly behind where my head had been resting on my folded jacket. I stared at those prints, at the deep impression in the soil where someone had stood perfectly still, and I tried to comprehend what I was seeing. This person had walked twice around my tent, then positioned themselves inches from my skull, with only a thin layer of nylon between us. They had stood there listening to me breathe, maybe watching my silhouette through the fabric, close enough to touch me if they wanted. The realization hit me in waves, first disbelief, then horror, then a cold and primal fear that made every hair on my body stand rigid. I was 7 miles from the trailhead, no cell service, no other campers. Just me and whoever was out there in the dark. Someone patient enough to circle my tent twice and careful enough to test my zipper 1 millimeter at a time. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to run. Just grab the beacon, hit the SOS button, and start moving toward the trailhead as fast as my legs could carry me. But 7 miles in the dark, on uneven terrain, with someone potentially following me. That was a death sentence of a different kind. Could twist an ankle in the first mile, could lose the trail entirely without daylight to guide me, could walk straight into whoever was waiting out there. So I made myself think. I grabbed my pepper spray from my pack and shoved it into my waistband. I found my knife and clutched it in my right hand. I pulled on my boots without bothering to lace them and dragged everything I could carry into the tent. My pack, my poles, even the rocks I used to stake down the corners. Then I zipped myself inside and sat with my back against the pack, facing the entrance. My headlamp pointed at the zipper like it was the only thing keeping me alive. I did not turn off the light. I did not close my eyes. I sat there for hours, listening to every sound the forest made, waiting for the zipper to start moving again. Dawn came slowly, the sky shifting from black to deep blue to gray in increments so gradual I almost did not notice. When enough light filtered through the nylon that I could see color again, I allowed myself one long exhale. I had not heard anything else during the night, no footsteps, no rustling, no second attempt at the zipper. But I was not foolish enough to think that meant I was safe. I packed my gear in record time, my hands fumbling with buckles and straps, shoving everything into my bag without the careful organization I normally insisted on. The boot prints were still there in the morning light, even clearer now, and I forced myself to photograph them with my phone before I left. I do not know why. Evidence, maybe, or proof to myself that I had not imagined the whole thing. The photos showed exactly what I had seen in the dark, 2 complete circles around the tent, deep impressions where someone had stood motionless at my head, and a single line of tracks leading back into the forest in the direction of nothing. I hiked out faster than I have ever moved in my life. What should have taken 4 hours took me just under 3, my legs burning, my lungs screaming, but I refused to stop for more than a few seconds at a time. Every snapping branch made me spin around. Every shadow between the trees looked like a figure waiting. I kept the pepper spray in my hand the entire way, my thumb on the trigger, ready for someone to step out of the forest and confirm my worst fears. But no one did. The trail remained empty, the woods remained silent, and when I finally reached the trailhead parking lot and saw my car sitting there untouched, I nearly collapsed against the hood. There were 2 other vehicles in the lot, a green pickup truck with Montana plates and a white sedan with a bike rack on top. I stared at them for a long moment, wondering if one of them belonged to whoever had visited my camp, wondering if they were still out there in the wilderness or if they had already driven away before dawn. I got in my car, locked the doors, and did not stop driving until I reached the ranger station 20 miles down the mountain. The ranger on duty was a woman named Colleen, mid-50s with gray streaks in her braid, and the kind of calm demeanor that made me feel safe for the first time in 12 hours. I showed her the photos, told her everything, the zipper, the boot prints, the way my things had been moved. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she told me I was not the first. There had been 2 other reports that summer, both from solo female hikers in the same general area. both describing similar experiences. Someone approaching their camp at night, testing tent zippers, moving equipment. One woman had woken to find her boots placed neatly outside her tent door, laces removed. Another discovered a small pile of rocks stacked beside her head, placed there while she slept. Colleen said they had increased patrols but never caught anyone, never found a permanent camp or any other evidence. She took down my information, filed a report, and told me to contact local law enforcement if I wanted to press further. I drove home that afternoon and did not go back to the Cascades for 2 years. I still hike. I refuse to let whoever that was take that away from me, but I never camp alone anymore, and I never will again. Sometimes at night, when I am lying in bed in my apartment with the doors locked and the city humming outside my window, I think about those boot prints circling my tent. I think about the patience it took to move that slowly, that quietly, to test a zipper one tooth at a time while a woman slept inches away. I think about what would have happened if I had not woken up, if the sound had not pulled me from sleep at exactly the right moment. The ranger told me they never caught anyone, and as far as I know, they still have not. I check the hiking forums sometimes, looking for new reports from that area, hoping I will read that someone was arrested, that the mystery was solved. But there is never any update, never any resolution. Just silence, and the knowledge that somewhere in those mountains someone is still out there, walking through the trees in the dark, circling tents, testing zippers, waiting for the ones who do not wake up. Nathan turned 26 on a Friday in early June, and since he had been talking about doing something different for months, our group decided to skip the usual bar crawl and rent a campsite at Pine Ridge Lake instead. The place was about 3 hours north of where we all lived in Ohio, tucked away in this sprawling state park that promised seclusion and good fishing. There were 5 of us making the trip: Nathan, his girlfriend Jenna, our friend Troy and his younger brother Danny, and me. We had all graduated from the same high school back in 2016, except for Danny, who was a few years behind us, and camping together felt like the kind of throwback adventure we needed after years of desk jobs and routine weekends. I remember packing that morning with this genuine excitement I had not felt in a long time, thinking about campfires and cold beers and staying up late telling stupid stories. The drive up was perfect, all green hills and that particular early summer light that makes everything look like a postcard. None of us could have known what was waiting for us at that lake. We pulled into the campground around 4 in the afternoon, and the ranger at the entrance booth was this older guy with a sun-weathered face who handed us a paper map and pointed us toward site number 17. The campground was laid out in a big loop around the lake, with maybe 30 sites total, but ours was at the far end where the loop curved back into thicker woods. I noticed immediately how isolated it felt. Site 16 to our left was completely empty, just a fire pit and a wooden post with the number on it, and beyond that the trees grew dense and dark. The ranger mentioned that weekday bookings were slow this time of year, and that we might have this whole section to ourselves. Nathan loved that idea, said it meant we could be as loud as we wanted without bothering anyone. We spent the next 2 hours setting up our tents, gathering firewood from the designated area, and hauling our coolers down to the site. Jenna had made this elaborate birthday cake that somehow survived the drive in a special container, and we stuck candles in it right there on the picnic table while the sun started dropping behind the tree line. By the time we got the fire going and cracked open the first round of beers, the sky was turning that deep orange color that only exists in places far away from city lights. Everything felt exactly right. The night came on fast and thick, the way it does when you are miles from any real town. We sat around the fire, passing a bottle of whiskey Nathan had brought, trading old stories and giving him grief about getting older. Danny had this portable speaker playing classic rock at a reasonable volume, and Jenna was roasting marshmallows with this very specific technique she kept insisting was the only correct way. Around 11, Troy mentioned he needed to grab something from the car, and when he came back he had this weird look on his face. He said he thought he saw a light moving through the trees near Site 16, like a flashlight beam sweeping low to the ground. We all looked over but saw nothing except darkness and the vague shapes of branches. Nathan figured it was probably the ranger doing a late patrol or maybe some animal reflecting our fire. We laughed it off, but I noticed Troy kept glancing in that direction for the next 20 minutes. The woods beyond our little circle of firelight seemed to press in closer than before, and the spaces between the trees looked deeper somehow, like they went on forever into nothing. Around midnight, we heard the laughter for the first time. It came from the direction of Site 16, this burst of sound that seemed to cut right through the quiet. It sounded like a group of people, maybe 3 or 4 voices, laughing at some joke we could not hear. Jenna said it was probably late arrivals setting up camp, people who drove in after dark to get an early start on their weekend. That made sense, and we all relaxed a little, though I remember thinking it was strange we had not heard a car pull up, or doors slamming, or any of the usual noise that comes with people arriving somewhere new. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it started, and the silence that followed was almost worse. Danny turned down his speaker, and we all sat there listening, waiting for more sounds. Voices, tent poles clicking together, a cooler being dragged across gravel. But there was nothing. Just the crackle of our fire and the occasional splash of something moving in the lake behind us. Troy said, maybe they were just passing through, hikers cutting across the campground on their way somewhere else. Nobody really believed that, but nobody wanted to say it out loud either. We tried to get back into the birthday mood, but the energy had shifted. Nathan poured another round of whiskey and made a toast about friendship and getting old, and we all raised our cups and drank. But the conversation kept dying in strange places. Every few minutes someone would pause mid-sentence and tilt their head toward the darkness, listening for something. Around 1 in the morning, Jenna said she was tired and wanted to turn in. She and Nathan shared the biggest tent, the green one closest to the fire pit, while Troy and Danny had a smaller blue tent a few feet away. I had brought my own single-person tent and set it up slightly apart from the others, near the edge of our site where the ground was flattest. As everyone started moving toward their sleeping bags, I stayed behind to pour water on the fire and make sure it was fully out. That is when I saw the flashlight beam again. It swept across the tree trunks about 50 yards into the woods, moving slowly from left to right, and then it stopped. The light held steady for maybe 10 seconds, pointed in my direction, and I could feel it like a physical weight on my chest. Then it clicked off and the darkness rushed back in. I stood there frozen with the water jug still in my hand, my heart slamming against my ribs, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. I did not tell the others what I saw. Part of me thought I was being paranoid, letting the weird laughter from earlier get into my head. I finished putting out the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it shut behind me with shaking fingers. For a long time I just lay there on top of my sleeping bag, fully clothed, staring at the nylon ceiling and listening. The campground was dead quiet now. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing except the occasional creak of branches settling. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I remember is waking up to hushed voices. It was Troy and Danny talking outside their tent in urgent whispers. I checked my phone and saw it was almost 3 in the morning. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and crawled out into the darkness, and Troy immediately grabbed my arm. He pointed toward Site 16 and told me to look. There was a figure standing at the edge of the empty campsite, maybe 40 feet from where we were. I could barely make out the shape in the darkness. A person, definitely a person, standing completely still and facing our direction. No flashlight, no movement, just standing there like they were watching us. Danny was breathing fast beside me, asking what we should do, but none of us had an answer. Troy grabbed a heavy flashlight from his tent and clicked it on, swinging the beam toward Site 16. The figure was gone. Just the empty fire pit and the wooden post with the number on it, and the dark wall of trees beyond. We swept the light back and forth across the tree line, but there was nobody there. No movement. Nothing to prove what we had all just seen. Danny wanted to wake up Nathan and Jenna, but Troy said we should wait. Said maybe it was just some drunk camper from another site wandering around lost. I knew that was not true, and I think Troy knew it too. But saying it out loud made everything feel slightly less insane. We agreed to take shifts staying awake and watching, and I volunteered for the first one. Troy and Danny went back into their tent, but I could hear them whispering for a long time before it finally went quiet. I sat on the picnic table bench with the flashlight in my lap, scanning the darkness every few seconds, my ears straining for any sound. An hour passed with nothing. Then another. By the time the sky started showing the faintest hint of gray on the horizon, I had almost convinced myself the whole thing was some kind of shared hallucination brought on by too much whiskey and not enough sleep. That is when I heard the footsteps. They came from behind me, from the direction of the lake, soft crunching sounds on the gravel and pine needles that covered the ground near the water. I spun around and raised the flashlight, but the beam only reached so far, dissolving into the mist that had started rising off the lake surface. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath and listened, and in that silence I heard something else. A low chuckle, barely audible, coming from somewhere in the fog. It was the same kind of laughter we had heard earlier, but this time it was just one voice, and it was close, maybe 20 feet away in the darkness. I wanted to yell for the others, but my throat had clamped shut. The chuckling stopped, and then I heard the footsteps again, faster now, moving away from me toward the parking area where we had left the cars. I finally found my voice and shouted for everyone to wake up. And within seconds, Nathan came bursting out of his tent, asking what the hell was going on. I pointed toward the parking lot, and we all grabbed whatever we could find. Flashlights, a hatchet Nathan had brought for firewood, a heavy metal thermos, and moved together through the darkness toward the cars. The parking area was about 100 yards from our campsite, connected by a narrow gravel path that wound through the trees. We moved in a tight group with Nathan in front and me bringing up the rear, flashlight beams cutting wild patterns through the darkness. Jenna was crying softly, asking over and over what was happening, and none of us had anything to tell her. When we reached the clearing where the cars were parked, Nathan stopped so suddenly that Troy walked right into his back. Our car, the only car since we had all driven up together in my SUV, sat alone in the gravel lot, tilted at a strange angle. Even before we got close enough to see the damage, I knew what had happened. All 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber hanging in ribbons around the rims. The whole vehicle sunk down onto its axles like a dead animal. Nathan circled the car with his flashlight, counting the cuts, and his voice cracked when he said there were at least 2 deep gashes in each tire. Whoever did this had taken their time. They had been thorough. Danny pulled out his phone to call for help, but there was no signal, not even a single bar. And when the rest of us checked our phones, it was the same story. We were 3 hours from home with no way to drive and no way to call anyone. Troy said we needed to walk to the ranger station near the entrance, that it was only about a mile down the main road, and someone would be there, or at least there would be a landline phone we could use. Nathan agreed, but Jenna refused to move, saying she was not walking through the dark with someone out there watching us. That is when we heard the sound that made everything worse. A tent zipper, the distinctive ripping noise of nylon teeth separating, coming from the direction of our campsite. We had left everything behind when we ran to check the cars, our supplies, our bags, everything. The 5 of us stood paralyzed in the parking lot, listening to the sounds of someone going through our camp. I heard a cooler lid slam shut, something heavy being dragged across the ground. Then that laughter again, louder this time, echoing through the trees like whoever was making it wanted us to hear. Jenna grabbed Nathan's arm and begged him to do something, but what could any of us do? There was one of them that we knew of, maybe more, and they clearly knew this place better than we did. They had been watching us all night, waiting, and now they had us exactly where they wanted us. Nathan made the call. We were going to the ranger station, all of us together, and we were going now. He handed the hatchet to Troy and told Danny to grab the biggest rocks he could find. Jenna was still shaking, but she nodded and fell into line between me and Nathan. We started down the main road, moving fast, flashlights pointed straight ahead. The road was paved but narrow, with thick woods pressing in on both sides, and every shadow looked like a person waiting to step out. About halfway to the ranger station, we heard footsteps in the trees to our left, keeping pace with us, crunching through the underbrush maybe 30 feet away. Nobody said anything. We just walked faster, almost running, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps matched our speed. Then they started getting closer. I could hear branches snapping, leaves rustling. and underneath it all that same low chuckling sound, like this was all some kind of game. Danny screamed and hurled one of his rocks into the darkness, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then a flashlight clicked on from inside the trees, blinding us with its beam, and a man's voice called out something I could not understand. Words that sounded slurred and wrong, like someone speaking through a mouthful of water. Troy raised the hatchet and shouted that he would kill anyone who came near us, and I believed him. I really did. The flashlight clicked off and we ran. We made it to the ranger station just as the sky was turning pink with dawn. The building was dark, but there was an emergency phone box mounted on the outside wall, and Nathan broke the glass with his elbow and dialed 911. The police arrived within 40 minutes. 2 county sheriff vehicles with lights flashing, and we told them everything while sitting on the tailgate of a patrol car wrapped in shock blankets. They searched the campground and found our site completely trashed. Tents collapsed and torn, coolers emptied, clothes scattered everywhere. They found footprints all around our camp, boot prints that did not match any of our shoes, and more prints leading into the woods toward an old service road that was not on any public map. A deputy told us they had received similar reports before, that there was a man who lived rough in these woods, a drifter with a history of mental illness who had been spotted near the campground several times over the past few years, but always disappeared before anyone could catch him. They never found him that morning either. We gave our statements and a tow truck came for my ruined car, and Nathan's dad drove 3 hours to pick us all up. None of us talked much on the ride home. Jenna broke up with Nathan a few weeks later, said she could not look at him without thinking about that night. Troy still refuses to go camping anywhere. And me, I still think about that man in the woods sometimes. Still wonder what would have happened if we had stayed in our tents, if we had not heard those footsteps moving toward the parking lot. The police said he probably just wanted to scare us, that drifters like him usually do not actually hurt anyone. But I remember that laughter, the way it sounded like he was enjoying himself, like we were the most fun he had in years. And I remember those slashed tires, the careful, deliberate cuts, and I know that whoever he was scaring us was not the only thing on his mind that night. I'd been looking forward to that camping weekend for weeks, mostly because life had been so loud lately that I needed a place where my phone couldn't buzz every 3 minutes. Back then, I was juggling a messy work schedule and crashing on a friend's couch while looking for a new apartment. So when my friend Lana suggested a quick escape to a lakeside campground a few hours from town, I jumped at it without thinking twice. It was me, Lana, her cousin Ivy, and our friend Paige. 4 of us crammed into Lana's aging SUV with way too many snacks and a playlist that barely held us together. We reached the site in the late afternoon, the kind of place where pine needles blanket everything and the lake sits so still it looks like it's holding its breath. Setting up camp felt almost therapeutic, staking the tents, dragging logs into a crude bench around the fire pit, and arguing over who was worst at tying knots. For the first time in a while, I felt like I could actually stretch my mind out and relax. The night eased in slowly, that bluish hour when the trees turn into silhouettes and conversations start to loosen. We made dinner on a small grill Lana insisted on bringing, even though it looked like it belonged in a museum. And after a while, someone pulled out a bag of marshmallows and we all started telling stories that got dumber and more chaotic with each drink. The fire crackled loud enough to make the surrounding woods feel farther away, like we were in our own bubble. At one point, Ivy tried to teach us a ridiculous campfire song she remembered from a childhood summer program, something involving hand motions none of us could replicate after 2 beers. We were loud, laughing, comfortable. Everything felt uncomplicated in the best way. Must have been close to midnight when Paige stopped mid-sentence and tilted her head toward the hill above our site. A narrow dirt road ran up there, empty as far as we knew, blocked from our campsite by a row of tall pines. But through the branches we caught the shape of a pickup truck parked on the road. No headlights, no movement, just the faint growl of an engine running low. At first we didn't quite register it. The fire was bright and our conversations were louder than our instincts. But the longer we looked, the stranger it felt that anyone would be up there, engine humming in the dark, without even a cabin light turning on. Lana muttered that maybe someone was just on the phone or taking a break. Paige joked that it was probably some guy who got lost trying to find a place to pee. None of us wanted to be the one to say the situation made us tense. Eventually, the truck rolled away, slow enough that we heard gravel shift, and the mood drifted back to normal. We pretended we weren't still thinking about it as we put out the fire and shuffled into our tents. I shared a tent with Lana, and we lay there talking quietly until the conversation thinned and sleep started pulling us under. Sometime deep in the night, I snapped awake to the sound of footsteps, measured steps heavy enough to compress the soil but soft enough that whoever it was didn't want to be noticed. I held my breath, listening as those steps moved between the tents, one pass then another, followed by a faint clink near the fire pit. Lana whispered something I couldn't make out, and for a long moment we just lay there, barely breathing, waiting for the sound to continue. But eventually the night fell silent again, and neither of us dared unzip the tent to check. By the time pale light began filtering through the tent fabric, my nerves felt stretched thin from a night of half-sleep. The others emerged around the same time, each of us pretending we'd rested fine until Ivy admitted that she'd heard someone brushing past her tent sometime before dawn. Paige said she thought she heard low breathing outside her door flap, but convinced herself it was the wind because the alternative made no sense in a place so remote. None of us wanted to bring up the truck again, but the memory of its silent shape hovering on the ridge stuck with us like a burr you can't shake off. We gathered around what was left of the fire pit as the sky shifted from gray to gold, trying to act like people who'd simply had an ordinary night outdoors. Lana walked toward the cooler to start breakfast, only to stop abruptly and call us over. The lid hung open and most of the food we'd packed was gone, not dragged out or torn apart by animals, just removed, neatly, intentionally. Some wrappers were stacked to the side like someone had gone through everything with a purpose. Our campsite didn't show any signs of wildlife poking around. No claw marks, no scattered trash, no tracks that looked like anything but boot prints. The kind you don't expect to see when you know the only shoes among your group belong to 4 women wearing sneakers with very different soles. Ivy pointed out a set of prints circling the fire area, deep and crisp, as if made only a couple of hours earlier when the ground was still damp. That realization sent a shiver through our group. Not panic exactly, but an unsettling awareness that someone had been studying our space while we slept. Paige backed away from the fire pit and moved toward her tent, saying she wanted to grab her phone to check the time. Then she stopped at the doorway, staring at the roof of the tent like she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Resting right in the center was a set of car keys. Not ours. Not from Lana's SUV. The key fob was old, scratched, attached to a small metal tag with numbers etched faintly into it. None of us recognized the brand stamped on the back. Paige didn't even want to touch them at first. She used the corner of her sleeve to lift them, turning them in her hand like some kind of warning had been left for us. That was when the memory of the footsteps clicked into place and made the whole scene feel heavier. Someone had walked between our tents, rummaged through our cooler, circled our fire, and left keys deliberately where they'd be seen. Lana's voice shook a little when she suggested maybe the keys belonged to someone who stopped by during the night for help. But if that were true, why not say something? Why not call out, and why take our food? We all kept scanning the tree line and the ridge above, half expecting to see that same truck watching us again. The woods around us felt unusually still, almost like the morning was waiting for us to decide our next move. Lana was the first to suggest packing up, and none of us argued. We moved quickly, not talking much, just collecting our things in a rhythm that bordered on frantic. Every few minutes, one of us would glance at the dirt road above the hill, expecting that truck to appear again. The morning air carried a calm that didn't match the atmosphere inside our circle. Even the birds felt quiet, like they were keeping their distance. I remember stuffing my sleeping bag into its sack with far more force than necessary, wanting nothing more than solid walls and a locked door. It didn't help that the boot prints around the campsite seemed clearer in the early light, as if the person who left them had lingered longer than we first thought. Once everything was in the car, Paige insisted we walk the perimeter one more time to be sure we hadn't missed anything important. I didn't want to, but leaving without checking felt worse. We followed her in tense silence as she traced the line of disturbed soil leading from the cooler area toward the trees. There were more prints than we had realized, some overlapping, some angled like the person had paused to look back at our tents. A broken twig here, a faint scuff on a rock there. At one point, Ivy crouched to examine a mark on the ground that looked like someone had knelt beside the fire pit. Maybe that same moment we heard the faint clink during the night. We didn't find any other belongings or clues, just the sense that whoever visited us had moved with intention. The drive back felt longer than the trip in. None of us talked much. We were too busy replaying that night from every possible angle, trying to justify the things that didn't make sense. Lana kept glancing in the rearview mirror, and every time her eyes flicked up, my pulse ticked a little faster. When we reached the main road, Paige pulled the unfamiliar keys from her pocket and set them in the cup holder between us. None of us wanted to bring them home, but tossing them in the woods felt wrong too, like ignoring something we should take seriously. Eventually, we agreed to leave them at a ranger station on the way back to town. The ranger who greeted us took one look at the keys and asked if we'd found them near the old logging trails. We hadn't mentioned anything about trails. When we told him which campsite we'd used, he let out a slow breath and said they'd had scattered reports over the years of a man who drove an older pickup through the back roads, watching campsites from a distance. No violence, just strange behavior. Early morning tire tracks, missing food, objects moved around, little things left behind. No one had ever caught him, or even gotten a description clear enough to help. According to the ranger, the keys didn't match any recent lost item reports. He promised to log them anyway, and told us we'd done the right thing leaving. That was the final push we needed. We went straight home and never camped in that area again. I still think about those footsteps in the dark and the quiet way that stranger moved around us, and I'm grateful every day that he left before any of us woke up fully. Camping at Pine Hollow State Park with my younger sister, Emily, was supposed to be a break from the noise of our everyday lives. I had just switched jobs, and she had taken a few days off from her internship, so disappearing into the woods felt like the right move at the time. We picked a small, isolated campground near a lake, the kind of spot where you can hear water brushing against the shore if everything else stays quiet. The evening felt peaceful enough, soft breeze, fire crackling, the smell of pine settling around us. Nothing that hinted anything strange was coming. We talked about work, about our parents, about how we both missed summer trips we used to take as kids. By the time we zipped up the tent for the night, it felt like life had slowed down just enough to breathe. Somewhere deep into the night, I woke up without knowing why. It wasn't cold, and there wasn't any obvious noise at first, just the usual nighttime sounds. Branches shifting, insects humming. Emily was asleep next to me, curled inside her sleeping bag. I was about to lie back down when a faint whisper crept through the fabric of the tent. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't some animal moving around. It was a voice, low, quiet, dragging the syllables like someone trying not to be heard. And it said my name, not shouted, not spoken normally. More like someone right outside our tent trying to get my attention without waking anyone else in the world. I thought I imagined it. I held my breath, listening, trying to figure out whether it was coming from the lake or the trees behind us. Then it said Emily's name, in that same breathy, drawn-out way. My sister stirred a little like she was dreaming, but she didn't wake up. I leaned closer to the tent wall, trying to see if someone's shadow would show through the fabric. But there was nothing. No footsteps. No crunch of leaves. Just that whisper slipping between the trees, repeating our names like whoever it was knew exactly who we were. I told myself some campers nearby must have overheard us earlier and were messing around. It was the only explanation that didn't make me want to unzip the tent and run. In the morning, we walked the whole campground expecting to find a group of teenagers laughing about their brilliant prank. But every site was empty. Not just empty, untouched. Picnic tables with a thin layer of pollen, charcoal grills without a single ember, fire rings that hadn't been disturbed in days. When we reached the small trail office by the entrance, The ranger checking his inventory told us we were the only people who had checked in the night before. His tone was casual, but he gave us a look like he was waiting for us to mention something. When I finally asked if he'd heard anything strange during the night, he paused just long enough to make my chest tighten, then said, "Visitors sometimes report voices in the woods, calling them by name, and that it usually happens right before someone vanishes on one of the trails." We tried to laugh it off as we walked back to our campsite, but the ranger's comment hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Emily kept glancing toward the tree line, the way you do when you feel like someone might step out at any second. I kept trying to think logically. Maybe the ranger was just trying to scare us into staying on marked trails. Maybe he exaggerated the stories. Maybe the whispers were just the wind shaping itself strangely through the branches. But none of those explanations lined up with the fact that the voice had used our names, spoken clearly enough that I recognized the exact tone. As we cleaned up the campsite and decided to take a short hike anyway, I kept replaying that whisper in my head, trying to convince myself it wasn't as clear as I remembered. The trail we picked was quiet in a way that didn't match the early afternoon light. Birds weren't making much noise, and even the leaves overhead seemed still, as if the whole forest was waiting for something. Emily walked ahead of me, pointing out weirdly bent trees or tracks in the dirt, trying to distract us. But neither of us could completely shake the tension crawling between us. At one point, we reached a fork in the path, and a wooden sign pointed left toward the overlook. I suggested going that way, but Emily hesitated, staring into the cluster of trees on the right trail as if something there had pulled her attention. When I asked what she saw, she said she thought she heard someone whispering again, this time farther away, like a distant voice threading through the undergrowth. We stood there for a minute, listening, but the woods were silent. I told her it was probably just her nerves reacting to the ranger's story, and she nodded, though she didn't look convinced. We kept going toward the overlook, and for a while things felt normal again. The air smelled like sun-warmed pine, and the trail opened up just enough for light to spill through. But as we got closer to the viewpoint, something shifted around us. Not a noise, not a movement. More like the forest had gone quiet in a way that felt intentional. Emily slowed until she was right beside me, and I noticed the tiny hairs on her arms standing straight up. She whispered my name, not to get my attention, but to ask a question without saying the whole sentence out loud. Did I hear it too? At first, I thought she meant footsteps or branches moving, but then the same low whisper from the night before drifted toward us from the trees off the trail. Only this time, it didn't sound like it was calling from outside a tent. It sounded like it was standing somewhere between the trunks, as if someone was hiding just out of sight. It said my name once, then hers, letting each syllable drag through the quiet afternoon. Emily's grip tightened on my arm, and every instinct in me pushed to get her away from that stretch of forest. We stepped backward, slow at first, then quicker, not turning our backs to the trees until we reached the fork again. Whatever was in those woods knew who we were. And it didn't sound confused or lost. It sounded like it wanted us to follow. Back at the campsite, we didn't even sit down. We threw everything into the trunk of my car with the kind of coordination that comes from shared panic, neither of us needing to say much. The woods around us felt different from the night before, brighter but somehow heavier, as if the sunlight was just a thin layer stretched over something waiting underneath. I kept expecting to hear that whisper thread between the trees again. Emily kept glancing toward the narrow path that led down to the lake, as though someone might walk up from the shoreline at any second. We weren't talking anymore. Every few seconds, one of us would pause and listen, trying to catch any sound that didn't belong. Even the breeze pushing through the pines seemed too quiet. Once we were in the car, the relief was short-lived. The road leading out of the campground cut through a long stretch of dense woods, and the trees leaned close on both sides like they wanted to hide whatever moved beneath them. I focused on the dirt road ahead, but Emily suddenly said my name in a timid, wavering voice I hadn't heard from her since we were kids. She pointed to her phone. She had no signal, but the lock screen kept turning on by itself, displaying a dark, blurry image, as if the phone had snapped a photo from inside her pocket. The picture showed nothing obvious, but the background looked too much like the trail we'd taken earlier. She swore she hadn't touched the camera. I didn't know what to tell her. All I knew was that we had to get out of those woods fast. When we reached the ranger station again, the same man from earlier stepped outside before we even parked, like he already sensed we were coming back. I told him, without much detail, that we'd heard something again on the trail and didn't feel safe staying. He studied us for a moment, then said quietly that people who hear their names in the forest usually describe the same thing. A voice that seems close but never shows itself. Some say it sounds like a family member. Others say it mimics the exact tone of someone they know. And according to him, every missing person case in the park started with that same detail. He advised us to go straight home and not linger anywhere alone between the trees. The certainty in his voice left no room for argument. We drove the entire way back to town without music, without stopping, barely speaking. Emily kept her phone in her lap, screen facing down, like she didn't trust whatever had caused it to light up. I kept replaying everything. The whisper outside the tent, the empty campsites, the voice on the trail, the ranger's warning. That night, neither of us slept well, and for weeks afterward, I'd hear faint noises whenever I passed wooded areas, even small patches of trees near the highway. Nothing ever called my name again, but the memory of how it sounded hasn't faded. I don't know what would have happened if we had followed the voice deeper into the forest. I'm just grateful we left when we did. Mornings at that campsite felt like a break from everything I'd been dealing with at home, and that was the whole reason I'd gone out there with my dog, Milo. I was 16, stubborn, and convinced that a few quiet days in the woods would clear my head before school started again. Milo was the kind of dog people remembered. A reddish mutt with mismatched eyes and a strange habit of tilting his head like he understood full sentences. We'd been on that trail before, but this time the place felt heavier. Like the air carried some kind of tension I couldn't pin down. I kept telling myself it was just because the campground was quieter than usual, with only one other spot occupied way down near the stream. I spent most of that day wandering around the area, letting Milo sprint ahead and catch sense, while I tried to settle into the idea of having actual peace for a bit. By late afternoon, the weather had shifted in a way that made the woods seem older, almost watchful. Milo kept pausing, staring toward the thick line of trees behind our tent with his ears pinned forward. Normally he was fearless, the type to chase after any sound without hesitation, but he kept circling close to me like he wasn't sure about something. I tried to laugh it off and tossed him a treat, thinking maybe he was just tired from the hike earlier. The campsite itself had this odd layout, tall pines on 3 sides and an uphill slope behind us where the ground dipped into a shadowy ravine. Every time the wind passed through that direction, the branches scraped in a way that reminded me of someone dragging cloth over bark. I kept pretending not to notice how often I looked back at it. Everything shifted around dusk, right when I was finishing dinner over the fire. Milo perked up suddenly, tail low, nose twitching as he stared again toward the ravine. Before I could say anything, he let out this soft, uneasy whine, one I'd only heard once before, the night he cut his paw on broken glass and tried to hide it from me. Then he trotted toward the tree line, glancing back as if expecting me to follow. I called after him, telling him not to go far, but he slipped between the trees anyway. His footsteps faded fast, swallowed up by the thick layers of pine needles and underbrush. A minute passed, then 2. Then the forest went still in a way that didn't feel normal for that time of day. When I finally called his name, the answer I got made my whole body react in a way I don't have a perfect word for. It was a whine, the same pitch Milo made when he wanted attention, but it echoed deeper in the woods, stretched slightly wrong, like someone trying to imitate him without understanding how real dogs breathe between sounds. The moment I heard it, I knew it wasn't him. Milo's real whine always had a tremble at the end, like he couldn't hold the note perfectly. This one cut off too clean, almost clipped, like whoever or whatever made it didn't know how to finish the sound naturally. I stood there, staring into the dark patch of trees where the response had come from, feeling this rising certainty that I shouldn't step closer to it, no matter what. I kept calling for Milo, But the woods stayed quiet except for that one strange response I couldn't get out of my head. It replayed in my mind over and over. The too clean ending. The way it seemed to come from farther away than Milo could have run in that short time. I waved my flashlight toward the trees, the beam catching on uneven patches of branches that looked like they'd been disturbed recently. Normally, Milo would have barked back or come sprinting toward the light, crashing through bushes without a care. But there was nothing. The longer I stood there, the more I noticed how the forest around me felt wrong for early evening. No insects buzzing, no rustling, no distant birds settling down. Just this thick silence that seemed to press against my ears. I kept telling myself he'd show up any second, but the part of me that knew Milo best kept saying something had lured him farther than he meant to go. Eventually, I grabbed the small camping lantern and stepped toward the edge of the ravine, stopping right before the slope dipped down. The ground there looked churned up in a weird way, as if someone had stepped repeatedly in the same spots, trying to flatten the grass. I crouched down, shining the light over the area, and spotted a few impressions that were definitely not from Milo. They were too long, too narrow, almost like footprints from someone walking carefully on the very edges of their feet. The spacing between them was strange too, like whoever made them had an awkward gait or was deliberately trying to mask their stride. The moment I noticed that, the wind shifted again from the ravine, carrying with it a faint smell that reminded me of wet rope and metal left out in the rain. It wasn't a scent I'd ever associated with animals out here. Panic started creeping up on me, but I forced myself to think rationally and headed back to the campsite. I kept the lantern high, scanning everything: the tent, the cooler, the scattered gear near the fire pit. Nothing looked disturbed, but the whole spot felt like it wasn't mine anymore, like someone else had been circling it while I wasn't paying attention. The shadows seemed longer than they should have been, stretching toward the tent in thin, crooked shapes that didn't match the trees behind them. I reached into the tent for my phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen stayed stubbornly blank. That isolation hit me harder than I expected. I stood there with my hand on Milo's empty leash, realizing I didn't even know which direction to start searching without risking getting lost myself. My instincts kept telling me to stay put until sunrise, but every few minutes I'd hear something subtle, a faint crack, a soft shift of leaves, coming from the same area Milo had run toward. Not close, but not far enough to ignore. It almost felt like someone was matching my movements from a distance, stepping only when I stepped, pausing only when I paused. At one point, I heard that imitation whine again, but this time it sounded quieter, like whoever made it was trying to lure me slowly instead of calling me directly. I stood perfectly still, gripping the lantern so hard the handle dug into my palm, listening to the echo fade into the trees. There was no way Milo would have responded like that. Whoever was out there had been practicing his sounds, waiting for the right moment. At some point in the night, exhaustion won over fear, and I ended up sitting with my back against a tree, trying to stay alert while fighting off the heaviness in my eyes. The lantern burned low, giving everything around me this washed-out pale look, like the world had been drained of color. Every so often I whispered Milo's name, quietly enough that if someone was listening, it wouldn't give away my position too clearly. The forest answered with nothing but that same thick quiet, and it felt like the trees themselves were holding their breath. When the lantern finally dimmed to its weakest glow, I noticed movement near the slope. Not a full shape, just a shift in the darkness, like someone stepping back the moment the light tried to catch them. That single moment convinced me I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been out there long before Milo wandered off. The hours before dawn stretched endlessly, and I kept replaying every sound I'd heard the day before. Milo sniffing around the trees, the branches scraping, the echoing fake whine. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe the thing, or person, had been circling us for more than just that evening. Around early morning, I heard a distant engine turning over near the trailhead. It was old, the kind of engine that rattles before settling, and it kicked on as if someone had been waiting for the exact moment sunlight started touching the trees. No voices, no doors slamming, no footsteps rushing away, just the engine humming steadily for a few seconds before fading down the dirt road. I stayed frozen where I sat, listening until the sound was completely gone. When it finally stopped, the forest seemed to loosen its grip on the silence. Once the sun pushed fully through the treetops, I grabbed my pack and headed toward the trailhead, calling for Milo in short bursts. My voice bounced strangely between the trees, like the forest hadn't quite woken up yet. I didn't get far before I spotted him, lying just a few yards off the path, half hidden behind a cluster of ferns. His fur was ruffled, and he had a shallow cut near his shoulder, like he'd brushed against something sharp or been grabbed roughly. He lifted his head when he saw me, tail thumping weakly against the ground, and the relief that hit me nearly knocked the breath out of my chest. I wrapped my arms around him, checking him carefully. His injuries weren't deep, but he looked shaken in a way I'd never seen before. He kept glancing past me toward the woods, as if expecting something to step out. I carried him back to the trailhead as fast as I could, and that's when I noticed something I'd missed earlier: tire tracks that didn't belong to any ranger vehicle. They were fresh, narrow, and uneven, like the vehicle had been loaded unevenly, or someone inside kept shifting weight. The tracks led away from the campground, the same direction the engine sound had gone. I didn't stick around to investigate. I just got Milo into the car and drove straight home. Even now, thinking back on it, I'm convinced someone had been watching the campsite for days, waiting for a chance to separate us. Whoever it was knew how to imitate Milo just well enough to lure him off, but not well enough to hide the mistake in the sound. That tiny flaw might have been the only thing that stopped me from walking into the trees that night. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The memories refuse to fade no matter how many years pass or how many times you try to bury them. Mine is from a Wednesday night in March of 2008. When I was 9 years old and still believed that locked doors could keep out anything dangerous. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a brick building in Newark, New Jersey, one of those places where the hallways always smelled like other people's cooking, and the elevator broke down at least twice a month. My dad worked at a distribution warehouse during the day, loading trucks and managing inventory, while my mom stayed home with me and my baby brother Mateo, who had just turned 8 months old and was in that phase where he drooled on absolutely everything. Our apartment was small, but my mom made it feel warm. With yellow curtains she had sewn herself and family photos covering every inch of wall space in the living room. I shared a room with Mateo at first, but a few months before that night my parents had converted the tiny storage closet at the end of the hallway into a bedroom just for me. It barely fit a twin mattress and a small dresser, but I loved it because it had a door that locked from the inside, a detail that would end up saving my life. My dad had been acting different in the weeks leading up to that night, though at 9 years old I did not have the words to describe what I was sensing. He came home later than usual, sometimes not until after I was already in bed, and I would hear him and my mom talking in hushed, urgent voices in the kitchen. Their conversations had a sharpness to them that made my stomach tight, even when I could not make out the actual words through my bedroom wall. Sometimes he would get phone calls on his cell and walk out onto the balcony to take them, pacing back and forth with his hand pressed against his forehead, like he was trying to hold something inside his skull. I asked my mom once if everything was okay, and she smiled that smile parents use when they are lying to protect you and said everything was fine, that Poppy was just tired from working extra shifts. I wanted to believe her. That Wednesday had been a normal day. School, homework at the kitchen table while my mom made rice and beans, playing peekaboo with Mateo until he laughed so hard he got the hiccups. My dad came home around 7, kissed my forehead, and barely touched his dinner. He kept checking his phone, kept glancing toward the front door like he was expecting someone. I went to bed at 9 like always and locked my little door out of habit. I woke up to the sound of our front door being kicked in. It was not like in the movies, where there is a dramatic crash and then silence. It was loud and fast and followed by shouting, deep male voices yelling things I could not understand at first, words blurring together into something that sounded like violence itself. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my ears, behind my eyes. I sat up in my little bed, pressing my back against the wall, and tried to make sense of what was happening on the other side of my locked door. I heard my mom scream, a sound I had never heard her make before, raw and terrified in a way that made her sound like a completely different person. Then my dad's voice, higher than normal, saying something like, "I told you I needed more time," over and over again. More yelling, something heavy hitting the floor. And then Mateo started crying from his crib in my parents' room, that piercing wail that babies make when they are truly frightened, and nobody went to comfort him. Nobody could. I pressed my ear against my bedroom door, trying to understand what was happening without making any noise. Through the thin wood, I could hear at least 3 different voices, maybe 4, and they were not speaking English. They sounded Eastern European, maybe Russian or Ukrainian, with accents that turned their words into something harsh and guttural. One of them kept repeating a number, something like 40,000, and every time he said it, my dad would respond in this broken, pleading voice that did not sound like my father at all. I heard my mom crying, asking them not to hurt anyone, promising that they would get the money somehow. One of the men laughed at that, this short, cruel sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the apartment. I wanted to open my door and run to my parents to make sure they were okay, but my body would not move. It was like my muscles had turned to stone, like some ancient survival instinct had taken over, and was screaming at me to stay hidden, to stay silent, to not let them know I existed. So I stayed pressed against that door, barely breathing, while my whole world fell apart on the other side. The violence escalated in waves. I heard what sounded like furniture being overturned, glass breaking, my mother begging in Spanish mixed with English. One of the men shouted at her to shut up, and then there was a sharp sound, like a slap, maybe something worse, followed by a thud and more crying. My dad started yelling then, really yelling, telling them to leave her alone, that she had nothing to do with this, that it was his debt and they should deal with him. Another impact, heavier this time, and my dad made this grunting noise that I still hear sometimes when I close my eyes. Mateo was screaming now, not just crying but screaming in that way babies do when they sense real danger, and no one was going to him. I wanted so badly to help, to do something, but I was 9 years old, and there were grown men in my apartment hurting my parents, and I did not even have a phone to call for help. My room had no window. It used to be a storage closet, remember? So I could not climb out or signal to anyone. I was trapped in a box at the end of a hallway, listening to my family being terrorized, and all I could do was stay quiet and hope they forgot I existed. That hope shattered when I heard footsteps coming down the hallway toward my door. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, like whoever was walking knew exactly where they were going. My mom started screaming again, different this time. She was screaming my name, telling me to hide, telling me not to open the door no matter what. Her voice cracked into something raw and desperate, and one of the other men must have done something to silence her because she went quiet in the middle of my name. The footsteps stopped right outside my room. I could see the shadow of feet blocking the thin line of light at the bottom of the door. There was a pause, maybe 2 seconds, maybe an eternity, and then the doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. The lock held, that cheap little brass lock that came with the door when my parents converted the closet, and I remember thinking it was never meant to keep anyone out. It was just meant to give a 9-year-old girl some privacy. Now it was the only thing between me and whoever was on the other side. The man on the other side of the door started talking, and his voice was different from the others. Lower, rougher, with a thickness to it that made every word sound like a threat. He spoke in accented English, slow and deliberate, asking who was in here. I did not answer. I could not answer. I had backed myself into the corner farthest from the door, wedged between my dresser and the wall, making myself as small as possible. He asked again, louder this time, and when I still did not respond, he switched to a different tone entirely. He started describing what he was going to do when he got inside. The things he said, I will not repeat them here, not even after all these years. They were things no child should ever hear. Things that painted pictures in my mind I have spent my entire adult life trying to erase. He was enjoying himself. I could hear it in his voice. This sick pleasure he was taking in terrorizing whoever was hiding behind this flimsy door. He did not know I was 9. He did not know I was a little girl clutching her knees to her chest and trying not to cry loud enough for him to hear. Or maybe he did know, and that made it worse. Then he started kicking the door. The first kick made the whole frame shudder, and I watched the wood splinter slightly near the lock. The second kick was harder, and I heard the hinges groan in protest. I was crying now. I could not help it. These silent tears streaming down my face while I bit down on my own hand to keep from screaming. On the third kick, a crack appeared in the door itself, running diagonally from the lock toward the top corner. He was going to get in. The lock was not going to hold. I was going to die in this tiny room that used to make me feel so grown up and independent, and my parents were not going to be able to save me because they were being held down in the living room by men who wanted money my father apparently owed. I thought about Mateo, still crying somewhere in the apartment, and I wondered if anyone would be left to take care of him. I thought about my mom's yellow curtains and the gold star sticker my teacher had given me that week, and how none of it mattered anymore. The man kicked again, and this time the crack widened. I could see a sliver of the hallway light through the damaged wood. And then another voice cut through the chaos, sharp, commanding, furious. Someone was yelling at the man trying to break down my door, yelling in that same foreign language but with an authority that made everything stop. The kicking stopped. The man outside my door said something back, defensive and angry, but the other voice overrode him immediately. I heard footsteps, multiple sets now, and then what sounded like a scuffle in the hallway just feet from where I was hiding. The commanding voice kept repeating something, and even though I did not understand the words, I understood the tone. He was telling the other man to back off. There was more arguing, voices overlapping, and then a single phrase in English that I will never forget as long as I live. The commanding voice said, clear as anything, "There are children here. We do not do this. We are not animals." The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it stretched out like hours in my memory. Then the footsteps retreated back down the hallway, away from my door, and I heard the men gathering in the living room again. I stayed in my corner, not moving, barely breathing, listening to what came next. The tone of the encounter had shifted entirely. The commanding voice? I think he must have been the leader, or at least someone with enough authority to control the others, was speaking to my father now, still angry but more controlled. He said something about this being a warning, about the next time being different, about 40,000 being pocket change compared to what they would take if my father did not pay. My dad's voice came back weak and shaky, promising he would get the money, promising he just needed 2 more weeks. There was a long pause, and then the leader said something I could not quite hear, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps moving toward the front door. They were leaving. I heard the broken front door scrape against the floor as they pulled it partially closed behind them, heard their footsteps echoing down the exterior hallway, heard the stairwell door slam shut. And then there was just the sound of my mother sobbing in the living room, my father groaning in pain, and Mateo still wailing from his crib. All the sounds of a family that had just been shattered into pieces I did not know how to put back together. I do not know how long I stayed in that corner before I finally unlocked my door. It could have been 5 minutes or 30. Time had stopped making sense the moment our front door was kicked in. When I finally stepped into the hallway, I saw my cracked bedroom door hanging crooked on its hinges, saw the gouge marks in the wood where that man had tried to break through. The living room looked like a tornado had torn through it. Our coffee table was overturned. One leg snapped clean off. The TV screen was shattered. My mom's yellow curtains had been ripped down from one side, hanging limp and defeated against the wall. My dad was sitting on the floor with his back against the couch, holding a dish towel to his face that was already soaked through with blood. His left eye was swollen shut and turning purple, and there was a gash above his eyebrow that probably needed stitches but would never get them because we were not going to the hospital. We were not going to the police. I understood that without anyone telling me, even at 9 years old. My mom was kneeling next to him, shaking so hard her teeth were chattering, trying to clean blood off his face while tears streamed down her own. I went to get Mateo from his crib because nobody else could. He was soaked in sweat, his little face red and blotchy from screaming for so long. And when I picked him up, he clung to me like I was the only solid thing left in his world. Maybe I was. I carried him into the living room and sat down next to my parents, and the four of us just stayed there on the floor for what felt like hours. Nobody talked. There was nothing to say. Eventually, my dad looked at me with his one good eye and said he was sorry, his voice cracking on the word in a way I had never heard before. He said he had made a mistake, that he had gotten involved in something he should not have, that he was going to fix it, and this would never happen again. I wanted to ask what kind of something, wanted to demand answers that made sense of how strangers could kick down our door and hurt my family over money. But I looked at his broken face and my mother's trembling hands and my baby brother's tear-streaked cheeks, and I realized that answers would not change anything. The damage was already done. We moved out of that apartment 2 weeks later, left everything we could not fit in our car, and drove to my aunt's place in Pennsylvania without looking back. My dad never told me exactly what he had been involved in, and I stopped asking after a while. I pieced together fragments over the years, overheard conversations, slips of the tongue, the way certain topics made my parents go quiet and exchange looks loaded with things they would never say out loud. From what I gathered, he had been running some kind of side operation through his warehouse job, moving goods that were not supposed to be moved, skimming money from people who did not take kindly to being skimmed from. He thought he could get away with it long enough to pay off some debts we had, maybe get us into a better apartment, give us a better life. Instead, he nearly got us killed. We stayed with my aunt for almost a year before my parents found jobs, and we could afford our own place again. My dad worked 2 legitimate jobs after that, day shift and night shift, 7 days a week until the circles under his eyes became permanent. He paid back what he owed. I do not know how, and I do not want to know. And those men never came for us again. But the man he used to be, the one who made silly voices when he read me bedtime stories, never fully came back either. I am 26 now, and I still cannot sleep with my bedroom door unlocked. Every apartment I have ever lived in, the first thing I do is check the locks, test the doors, map out where I would hide if someone broke in. I flinch at loud noises. I panic when I hear footsteps in hallways late at night. For years I had nightmares about that cracked door, about the sliver of hallway light widening as the wood gave way, about what would have happened if that other man had not intervened. Sometimes I wonder about him, the one who stopped it. I wonder if he had children of his own, if that is why he drew the line where he did. I wonder if he ever thinks about the little girl he saved without even knowing her name. My therapist says I have made incredible progress, that I have built a life despite carrying this weight, and maybe she is right. But there are still nights when I wake up in the dark, heart pounding, convinced I can hear heavy footsteps coming down the hallway toward my door. And I lie there, barely breathing, 9 years old again, waiting for the kicking to start. My cousin graduated high school the same year I started 2nd grade, which should give you an idea of how small I was compared to the older kids in our neighborhood. We lived in a suburb outside of Denver, one of those places where new developments kept popping up faster than families could fill them. There was this one section about 3 blocks from my house, a half-finished housing project that had stalled when the construction company ran out of money. The frames of houses stood like wooden skeletons, surrounded by dirt piles, abandoned equipment, and all sorts of debris that became our unofficial playground. My mom worked double shifts at the hospital back then, and my dad had moved to Seattle after the divorce, so I spent most of my summer days roaming around with whatever kids would let me tag along. I was small for my age, quiet, the kind of kid who laughed at jokes I did not understand just to feel included. That summer of 2008 changed something inside me permanently, And even now, almost 2 decades later, I still check twice before entering any enclosed space. The older kids in the neighborhood had a loose hierarchy that I never fully understood, but I knew enough to recognize that being invited to hang out with them was supposed to be an honor. There was this kid named Trent Holloway who lived at the end of Birchwood Lane. He was maybe 13 or 14, tall with a buzz cut and a chipped front tooth he claimed came from a fight, but probably happened falling off his bike. His younger brother Shane was 12, built like a refrigerator, always wearing the same faded Denver Broncos jersey regardless of the weather. A girl named Kelsey from 2 streets over hung around them constantly, freckled and mean in that casual way some kids perfect by middle school. There were others who drifted in and out, neighborhood kids whose names I barely remember now. But those 3 were the core group. They found me walking alone near the construction site that Wednesday morning, kicking rocks and pretending I had somewhere important to be. Trent called out to me, asked if I wanted to see something cool they found in the unfinished houses. I should have kept walking. I followed them through a gap in the chain-link fence that was supposed to keep people out of the construction site. The metal had been peeled back so many times by neighborhood kids that it curved permanently outward like a wound that refused to heal. We walked past stacks of warped plywood, rusted rebar poking out of concrete slabs, and a bulldozer that had not moved in so long that weeds had started growing through its treads. The July sun was brutal that day, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the dirt and turned every metal surface into a branding iron. Trent led the way with Shane right behind him, and Kelsey walked next to me, close enough that her elbow kept bumping mine. She asked me questions about school, about my mom, about whether I'd ever kissed a girl. I answered everything, desperate to seem cool, not realizing she was gathering ammunition. The deeper we walked into the site, the more isolated I felt. The sounds of cars and lawnmowers faded until all I could hear was our footsteps crunching on gravel and the occasional creak of unstable wood settling in the heat. They brought me to what was supposed to be the basement of one of the unfinished houses. The walls were poured concrete, gray and cold despite the summer heat, and the floor was just packed dirt with puddles of stagnant water in the corners. Construction materials were scattered everywhere: pipes, wooden beams, bags of hardite cement that had absorbed moisture and turned solid. But the thing that caught my attention was this massive barrel sitting against the far wall. It was industrial-sized, the kind you see on the back of trucks carrying chemicals or industrial waste, maybe 4 feet tall and wide enough that I could have fit inside with room to spare. The plastic was dark blue, faded and scratched, with a lid that had been removed and set aside. Trent walked over to it and slapped the side, and the hollow boom echoed off the concrete walls. He turned to me with this grin that showed his chipped tooth and asked if I wanted to see what was inside. Shane and Kelsey were already moving to position themselves between me and the only way out, a wooden ramp that led up to ground level. I did not notice that at the time. I was too focused on trying to impress them, too eager to prove I was not scared of anything. Trent told me the barrel was a time machine. He said it with a straight face, like he was letting me in on a secret the other kids in the neighborhood did not know about. If you climbed inside and closed your eyes, you could travel anywhere you wanted. That was the game. Shane nodded along, adding that he had done it twice already and gone back to see dinosaurs. Kelsey said she had visited the future and seen flying cars. Even at 7 years old, I knew they were lying. I knew this was some kind of trick. But the way they were all looking at me, waiting, expectant, made my legs move toward that barrel anyway. I told myself I would just look inside, just peek over the edge to see what was in there. The inside was dark, stained with something brown that could have been rust or dirt or something worse. It smelled like old rainwater and chemicals. Trent put his hand on my shoulder, friendly, encouraging, and asked if I was brave enough to try it. His grip was tighter than it needed to be. I said sure I would try it. I still remember the exact moment I decided to climb in. The way my sneakers squeaked against the plastic rim. The way the barrel wobbled slightly under my weight. I thought I was being brave. I thought this was what it took to finally belong. The second I was fully inside, everything changed. The barrel was deep enough that when I crouched down, my head was below the rim. The plastic walls curved around me, slick and cold against my arms. I heard Trent say something to the others, and then there was a scraping sound, the lid. They were putting the lid back on. I shot up immediately, tried to push against it, but Shane was already pressing down with both hands. The lid was not designed to lock, but it fit snugly into a groove at the top of the barrel. And with someone holding it in place, there was no way I could push it off from inside. I started yelling, asking them to stop, telling them this was not funny. Through the thin plastic, I could hear them laughing. Kelsey made her voice high and mocking, imitating my panic, and the other two laughed even harder. I pounded on the walls with my fists, kicked at the bottom, screamed until my throat burned. The air inside was already getting thick, hot, hard to breathe. Every exhale bounced back at me from the curved walls, warm and damp against my face. I begged them to let me out. I used the word please over and over, something I had been taught meant people had to listen. They did not listen. They just kept laughing, their voices distorted through the plastic like sounds from another world. Time stopped making sense inside that barrel. It could have been 5 minutes or an hour, I had no way of knowing. The heat was unbearable, sweat pouring down my face and stinging my eyes, my shirt soaked through and sticking to my skin. I tried to calm down, tried to breathe slowly like my mom had taught me when I had nightmares, but every breath felt like it was not enough. The walls seemed to press closer with each passing second, even though I knew that was impossible. I could hear them talking outside, their voices casual now, bored even. Shane asked Trent how long they should keep me in there. Trent said until I stopped crying, then maybe a little longer to teach me a lesson. Kelsey suggested they go get sodas from her house and come back later. The idea that they might leave me there, alone in the dark, made something inside me snap. I started screaming again, not words anymore, just raw sound tearing out of my throat. I clawed at the lid, at the walls, felt my fingernails bend backward against the hard plastic. One of them broke, and I felt the sharp sting of blood on my fingertip. But I did not stop. I could not stop. Every instinct in my body was telling me I was going to die in that barrel, suffocated and forgotten in the basement of a house that would never be finished. Then I heard a different sound, a deep, low groan that did not come from any of the kids. The barrel shifted beneath me, tilting slightly to one side. I heard Kelsey say something, her voice suddenly uncertain, and Shane asked what that noise was. The groan came again, louder this time, followed by a cracking sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I did not understand what was happening, but I felt the barrel move again, sliding a few inches across the dirt floor. Outside, Trent shouted something I could not make out, and then there was chaos. Footsteps running, voices overlapping, another crack that sounded like wood splitting. The barrel tipped further, and I braced myself against the curved walls, my heart pounding so hard. I could feel it in my teeth. Something was wrong with the structure above us. Later, I would learn that the wooden supports holding up the floor of the house above the basement had been rotting for months, weakened by rain and neglect. The weight of the construction materials stored up there, the pipes, the bags of cement, the leftover lumber, had finally become too much. The floor was collapsing, and I was trapped directly underneath it. The first piece of debris hit the barrel like a hammer. A wooden beam, maybe, or a chunk of concrete. I never found out exactly what it was. The impact dented the plastic inward, pressing against my shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise that would last for weeks. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the noise of the collapse, cracking, crashing, the thunder of heavy objects falling. The barrel rolled, and suddenly I was tumbling inside it, my head slamming against the walls, my elbows and knees scraping against the rough plastic. Dust poured in through the seam where the lid met the rim, filling my mouth and nose, making me choke. I curled into a ball, made myself as small as possible, and prayed to a God I had only heard about in Sunday school. The world outside was ending, or at least it sounded that way. I felt something massive land on top of the barrel, pressing the lid down so hard that the plastic groaned under the strain. For one terrible moment, I was certain the whole thing would crush inward and flatten me like an insect. But the barrel held. It was industrial grade, built to survive being dropped off trucks and dragged across warehouse floors. That cheap, ugly blue plastic container became the only thing standing between me and a ton of falling rubble. When the noise finally stopped, the silence was almost worse. I could not move. The barrel was wedged at an angle, pinned in place by whatever had landed on top of it, and the space inside had shrunk, the dented walls pressing against me from multiple directions. I could feel blood trickling down my forehead, warm and sticky, mixing with the sweat and dust on my face. My left arm was twisted under my body, throbbing with a pain that told me something was probably broken. I tried to call for help, but my voice came out as a whisper, my throat too raw from screaming. I did not know if the other kids were still there. I did not know if anyone would ever find me. The air was thick with dust, and every breath felt like inhaling sandpaper. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the settling sounds of debris shifting above me, and I made myself a promise. If I got out of this alive, I would never let anyone trap me anywhere ever again. I would never be small and quiet and desperate to belong. I would become someone who could not be pushed into barrels and forgotten. It was a childish promise, the kind you make when you think you are about to die, but I meant every word of it. I do not know how long I was in there after the collapse. It felt like hours, but it was probably closer to 20 or 30 minutes. What saved me was a man named Harold Finch, a retired electrician who lived on the other side of the construction site. He had been walking his dog when he heard the crash, and unlike most people who would have just called the authorities and waited, Harold grabbed a flashlight from his garage and went to investigate. I learned all of this later, of course. In the moment, all I knew was that suddenly there was a voice calling out, asking if anyone was there. I tried to answer, tried to yell, but all that came out was a weak croak. It was enough. Harold heard me. He started pulling debris away, piece by piece, working carefully so nothing else would shift and collapse further. I could hear him grunting with effort, cursing under his breath, calling out to me every few seconds to keep talking so he could follow the sound. When he finally pulled the lid off that barrel and I saw his face, weathered, covered in dust, eyes wide with shock, I burst into tears. He lifted me out like I weighed nothing, cradled me against his chest, and carried me up the wooden ramp and out into the sunlight. The brightness hurt my eyes after so long in the dark. I remember thinking that the sky had never looked so blue, so impossibly endless after being trapped in that tiny curved space. The ambulance came, and then the police. My mom arrived still wearing her hospital scrubs, mascara running down her face, trembling so hard she could barely hold me. I had a fractured wrist, a concussion, and cuts that needed stitches across my forehead and both hands. The doctors said I was lucky. If the barrel had been positioned a few feet in either direction, if it had not been industrial grade, if Harold Finch had decided to just call 911 and wait instead of going in himself, I would have been crushed. Trent, Shane, and Kelsey had run the moment the structure started groaning. They told their parents they had been playing in Kelsey's backyard all morning, and for a few days, it looked like they might get away with it. But Harold had seen them fleeing the site, and I eventually told the police everything. There were meetings with lawyers, tearful apologies from parents who could not believe their children would do something like that, promises that it would never happen again. The Holloways moved away before the summer ended. I heard later that Trent got sent to some kind of behavioral program in another state. Kelsey's family stayed, but she never looked at me again, not once, like I had become invisible the moment I stopped being useful to torment. I did not care. I was alive, and that was the only thing that mattered. It has been almost 20 years since that day, and I wish I could tell you the memory has faded into something manageable, something I can look back on without feeling my chest tighten. But trauma does not work that way, at least not for me. I still cannot use elevators without my heart rate spiking. I avoid MRI machines, phone booths, any space where the walls feel too close. A few years ago, my girlfriend at the time suggested we try one of those escape room experiences for her birthday, and I had to leave the waiting area before we even started. Just seeing the small rooms on the promotional photos was enough to make me dizzy. I have done therapy, tried different medications, learned breathing techniques that sometimes help and sometimes do not. The claustrophobia is manageable now most days, but it never fully goes away. It lives in my body like a second heartbeat, quiet until something triggers it, and then suddenly I am 7 years old again, curled up in the dark, listening to other children laugh while I beg to be let out. The worst part is not the fear itself. It is knowing exactly where it came from, knowing that it was planted in me deliberately by kids who thought my terror was entertainment. I looked up Trent Holloway a few years ago, just out of curiosity. He is an insurance adjuster now, living somewhere in Texas, married with 2 kids based on his social media. He looks normal, happy even, like a man who has never done anything worth regretting. I do not know if he ever thinks about that day, about the boy he shoved into a barrel and left to die. Probably not. People have a remarkable ability to forget the harm they cause when they are young, to file it away as just kids being kids. But I remember. I remember the sound of the lid scraping into place, the echo of my own screams bouncing off plastic walls, the weight of the world collapsing on top of me. I remember Harold Finch's face when he pulled me out, the way he kept saying, "It is okay. You are okay, son," even though we both knew nothing about that situation was okay. I sent Harold a card every Christmas until he passed away 6 years ago. His family invited me to the funeral, and I stood in the back and cried for a man who had no obligation to save me, but did it anyway. That is the thing about people. Some of them will lock you in barrels and laugh, and some of them will dig through rubble with their bare hands to pull you out. I got to meet both kinds before I turned 8 years old. I try to be the second kind now, every single day. It is the only thing that makes the memory bearable. My mom still apologizes for that Saturday in March of 2015, even though I keep telling her it was not her fault. I had just turned 10 a few weeks before, and we lived in this small 2-bedroom house on Crescent Lane, in a quiet neighborhood outside of Portland, Oregon. My parents had divorced when I was 6, so it was just me and Mom most of the time. She worked as a nurse at a clinic downtown, and that particular weekend she was supposed to be off. Our neighbor's daughter, a college girl named Heather, usually watched me whenever Mom had to leave. But Heather had called that morning saying she caught some stomach bug and could barely get out of bed. Mom tried 3 other people, but nobody was available on such short notice. I remember her pacing the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, looking more stressed than I had ever seen her. The emergency was my grandmother. She had fallen in her apartment across town, and the building manager found her on the bathroom floor, conscious but unable to get up. Mom explained everything to me in that serious voice she used when she needed me to understand something important. She said she would be gone for 1 hour, maybe less, and that I should not open the door for anyone, not answer the phone unless it was her number on the caller ID, and stay inside no matter what. She made me repeat the rules back to her twice. I was a responsible kid, always had been, and I think she trusted me more than most parents would trust a 10-year-old. She kissed my forehead, grabbed her keys, and backed out of the driveway in her old blue Subaru. I watched through the front window until the car disappeared around the corner, and then I was alone. The house felt different immediately, bigger somehow, like the walls had stretched outward the moment she left. I decided to watch cartoons to pass the time. I grabbed the remote, curled up on the couch with my favorite blanket, the green one with little white stars that my dad had given me before he moved to Seattle, and flipped to a channel playing old Scooby-Doo episodes. The clock on the wall read 11:42. Mom said she would be back by 12:30 at the latest. I remember doing the math in my head, thinking that was only 48 minutes away, not even a full hour of cartoons. The sun was bright outside, streaming through the curtains, and everything felt normal. Our cat, a fat orange tabby named Pumpkin, jumped onto the couch and curled up against my legs. I scratched behind his ears and focused on the screen, where Shaggy and Scooby were running from a guy in a monster costume. I must have been watching for about 15 minutes when the first knock came. It was soft, almost polite. 3 gentle taps on the front door. Pumpkin lifted his head, ears rotating toward the sound like little satellite dishes. I muted the television and sat very still. Mom had been clear about not opening the door, but she had not said anything about not looking. I slid off the couch and crept toward the front window, staying low the way I had seen people do in movies. The curtains had a small gap where they did not quite meet in the middle, and I pressed my eye to that gap, trying to see the porch. There was a man standing there. He was tall, maybe in his 40s, wearing a dark green jacket and jeans. He had a clipboard in one hand and a baseball cap pulled low on his forehead, the kind of cap with no logo, just plain gray fabric. He did not look scary exactly, but something about the way he stood bothered me. He was too still, like he was listening rather than waiting. He knocked again, harder this time. 4 sharp raps that made the door rattle in its frame. I pulled back from the window and pressed my back against the wall, heart beating fast in my chest. Pumpkin had jumped off the couch and was standing in the hallway, tail puffed up to twice its normal size, staring at the door. Then the man spoke. His voice was calm, friendly even, the kind of voice a teacher might use when explaining something to a student. He said he was from the electric company, that there had been some reports of power surges in the neighborhood, and he needed to check our meter. He said it would only take a minute. I stayed frozen against the wall, barely breathing, remembering what Mom had told me. Do not open the door for anyone. The man waited a few seconds, then knocked again, louder now, the friendly tone slipping from his voice like a mask falling off. He said he knew someone was home because he could see the television light flickering through the window. He said he really needed to check that meter, that it was important, that there could be a fire hazard if he did not inspect it today. His voice had an edge to it now, something sharp underneath the polite words. I wanted to yell that my mom would be home any second, but my throat felt like it had closed up completely. The knocking became pounding, 5 or 6 heavy blows that shook the whole door, and then suddenly it stopped. Complete silence. I counted to 30 in my head, then to 60, waiting for something else to happen. I thought maybe he had given up and left. I was about to peek through the curtain gap again when I heard footsteps, but they were not going away from the house, they were going around it. The footsteps crunched on the gravel path that ran along the side of our house, the path that led to the backyard, to the back door. My bedroom was at the back of the house, and so was the kitchen, and the back door had this old lock that Mom always complained about, saying she needed to get it replaced because it was flimsy and loose. I heard the footsteps stop. Then I heard the back doorknob rattle, a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the quiet house. Pumpkin hissed, actually hissed, something I had never heard him do in the 4 years we had owned him. The rattling stopped for a moment, and I let myself hope that the lock had held, that he would go away now. That hope died when I heard a heavy thud against the back door, then another, then a third one that made the whole frame groan. He was throwing his shoulder against it, trying to break it down. I ran. I did not think about it, did not plan it. My legs just moved on their own. I sprinted down the hallway to my bedroom and dove into my closet, pulling the door shut behind me and burying myself under a pile of dirty laundry and old stuffed animals. The closet smelled like dust and the strawberry shampoo from my unwashed clothes, and I pressed both hands over my mouth to keep from making any sound. Through the thin walls, I heard a loud crack, the unmistakable sound of wood splintering, and then a heavy thump as the back door swung open and hit the kitchen wall. He was inside. I heard his boots on the linoleum, slow and deliberate, not rushing at all like he had all the time in the world. I heard him open a cabinet, then another, the hinges squeaking in that familiar way I had heard 1,000 times when Mom made dinner. Then came a sound that made my whole body go cold, a long metallic scrape, the sound of something being dragged across the counter. I knew exactly what that sound was because I had heard it every time Mom pulled a knife from the wooden block next to the stove. He had taken a knife from our kitchen. The footsteps left the linoleum and moved onto carpet, which meant he was in the living room now. I heard him pause, probably looking around, and then the footsteps resumed, heading down the hallway toward the bedrooms. Toward me. I squeezed my eyes shut so tight that colors exploded behind my eyelids, and I prayed harder than I had ever prayed in my entire life. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. I could hear him breathing, heavy and slow, and I could see his shadow through the crack at the bottom of the closet door, a dark shape blocking the light from the hallway. The bedroom door creaked open. I heard him step inside, heard the floorboard by my dresser groan under his weight, the same floorboard that always woke Mom up when she came to check on me at night. He was maybe 10 feet away from where I was hiding, separated only by a closet door and a pile of laundry. I bit down on my own hand to keep from screaming, tasted blood on my tongue, and waited for the closet door to open. Then a car door slammed outside. The sound was distant but unmistakable, and I heard the man freeze, his breathing stopping for a second. Another sound followed, the beep of a car being locked, and then footsteps on the front porch, quick and hurried. Mom. She was back early. I heard her keys jangling as she searched for the right one, and the man in my room moved fast, his boots thumping against the carpet as he left, heading back down the hallway toward the kitchen. I heard the back door bang against the wall again as he ran through it, heard his footsteps pounding across the backyard, getting fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely. The front door opened and Mom called my name, her voice normal at first, almost cheerful, saying that Grandma was okay and it was just a minor bruise. Then her voice changed. She had seen something, maybe the back door hanging open or the mess in the kitchen, and she screamed my name in a way I had never heard before, pure terror and desperation. I burst out of the closet and ran to her, crashing into her arms so hard that we both almost fell over, and I started crying. These huge, ugly sobs that I could not control no matter how hard I tried. Mom held me tight and kept asking what happened, but I could barely get the words out between sobs. She walked through the house with me clinging to her side, and I watched her face go pale as she took in the details. The back door was hanging off one hinge, the frame cracked and splintered where the lock had given way. There were muddy footprints on the kitchen floor, large boot prints that tracked across the linoleum and onto the living room carpet, making a path through our home like a violation written in dirt. The wooden knife block on the counter had an empty slot where the biggest knife should have been, the 8-inch chef knife that Mom used to cut vegetables for dinner. She checked the living room window and found it unlocked. The latch turned to the open position, which meant he had planned an alternate escape route before he even broke in. That detail scared her more than anything else, she told me later. It meant he had thought this through, had walked around our house and tested the windows, had made a plan. The police arrived within 15 minutes of Mom calling them. 2 officers, a man and a woman, both of them taking notes while I sat on the couch wrapped in my green blanket with pumpkin pressed against my chest. I told them everything I could remember: the dark green jacket, the gray baseball cap with no logo, the clipboard he had been holding, the way his voice changed from friendly to threatening. They took photographs of the footprints, dusted the doorknobs and window latch for fingerprints, and bagged the broken pieces of the door frame as evidence. One of the officers told Mom that there had been 2 other break-ins in neighborhoods nearby over the past month. Same method. Someone posing as a utility worker and targeting houses during the day when most people were at work. They never caught him. Months went by, then years, and they never found out who he was or where he went. The detective assigned to our case called a few times in the beginning. Then the calls became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. The file is probably sitting in a box somewhere, unsolved, just another statistic. We moved out of that house 3 weeks later. Mom found an apartment in a bigger complex with security cameras and a doorman, and she had a deadbolt installed that was so heavy it took both hands to turn. She also signed me up for self-defense classes and bought a baseball bat that she kept beside her bed for years. I am 20 now, a junior in college studying psychology, and I still check every lock twice before I go to sleep. I still look through the peephole whenever someone knocks, even if I am expecting a package. And sometimes, when the house gets too quiet, I hear those slow, deliberate footsteps on linoleum, and I feel that knife-shaped absence in my chest, that empty slot where safety used to be. We never found out what he wanted, whether it was robbery or something worse, and maybe that is the part that still haunts me most. Not knowing. The not knowing is its own kind of scar, the kind that never fully heals, just fades enough that you can pretend it is not there until something reminds you. A knock on the door, a stranger in a cap, the sound of boots on a hard floor. Then it all comes back fresh as the day it happened, and I am 10 years old again, hiding in a closet, biting my hand to keep from screaming. Lily had just turned 6 the week before, and she had been begging me for days to take her to see the new dolls at Brennan's, this big department store about 20 minutes from our apartment in Wilmington. It was a Saturday afternoon in April 2017, one of those bright spring days where the sun made everything feel safe and normal. I had just wrapped up a long week managing inventory at a warehouse distribution center. The kind of job where you spend most of your time staring at spreadsheets and wondering how you ended up there after college. My husband was out of town visiting his mother in Virginia, so it was just me and Lily for the weekend. She was wearing her favorite purple jacket, the one with the little butterfly patches she had picked out herself, and her hair was in two messy pigtails because I never could get them as neat as my mom used to do mine. We walked into that store holding hands, and I remember thinking how much I loved these small moments with her, just the two of us on a simple Saturday errand. Brennan's was crowded that day, packed with families doing their weekend shopping, and the toy section sat in the back corner of the second floor. We took the escalator up, Lily bouncing with excitement the whole ride, her little fingers gripping the rubber handrail. The store had this particular layout, where the toy aisles formed a maze of bright colors and cardboard displays, and the doll section was right next to a wall of stuffed animals that stretched from floor to ceiling. I parked our cart at the end of the aisle and told Lily she could walk ahead to look at the dolls while I checked my phone for a message from my husband. She skipped forward maybe 10 feet, still completely within my sight, her purple jacket like a beacon among the pastel packaging. I glanced down at my phone for what felt like 3 seconds, maybe 5 at most. When I looked up, a woman I had never seen before had her hand wrapped around my daughter's wrist and was pulling her toward the opposite end of the aisle. The woman was maybe in her late 40s, with short auburn hair that looked freshly dyed and a beige cardigan over a floral blouse. She looked like someone's aunt, like someone you might see at a PTA meeting or a church potluck. That was the thing that made everything feel so surreal in those first seconds. She did not look threatening at all. She was leaning down toward Lily with this calm, patient expression, the kind of face adults make when they are trying to reason with a fussy child. Lily was pulling back, her little sneakers squeaking against the linoleum, and I could see the confusion on her face turning into fear. I dropped my phone. I think it hit the floor, but I did not hear it, and I started moving toward them. Everything felt like it was happening underwater, too slow and too fast at the same time, and I remember my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The woman saw me coming, and her expression did not change at all, which was somehow worse than if she had looked panicked or guilty. She tightened her grip on Lily's wrist and started walking faster, saying something to my daughter in this low, even voice. I was close enough now to hear the words, and they made my whole body go cold. She was saying, "Come on, sweetie, your mom is waiting for us by the car. Do not make a scene, okay? Do not make a scene." Lily looked back at me with these wide, terrified eyes, and she opened her mouth and screamed the word "mommy" so loud that people 3 aisles over must have heard it. The woman flinched but did not let go, and I closed the distance between us in what felt like 2 steps, grabbing Lily's other arm and yanking her toward me with every ounce of strength I had. For a moment we were locked in this horrible tug of war, my daughter between us like a rag doll, and I remember screaming something at the woman, but I have no idea what words came out of my mouth. It was pure animal instinct, nothing coherent, just raw noise and fury. The woman finally let go so suddenly that Lily and I stumbled backward into a display of board games that crashed to the floor around us. I pulled Lily into my chest and wrapped both arms around her, feeling her small body shaking against mine, her face pressed into my neck. The woman stood there for maybe 2 seconds, staring at us with this blank expression that I still see sometimes when I close my eyes at night. Then she turned and walked quickly toward the back of the store, not running but moving with purpose, like she had somewhere specific to be. A store employee appeared at the end of the aisle, a young guy with a red vest and a confused look on his face, asking if everything was okay. I could barely get the words out. I kept pointing toward where the woman had gone, trying to explain that she had just tried to take my daughter, but my voice was coming out in these broken gasps that did not sound like language. Lily was crying into my shoulder, repeating, she grabbed me," over and over, and other shoppers were starting to gather around us with their phones out. The employee radioed for security, and within a minute there were 2 guards standing with us, a man and a woman, both of them asking me to describe what happened. I gave them every detail I could remember about the woman. Her hair color, her cardigan, the floral pattern on her blouse, her calm voice that still echoed in my head. The female guard asked me to come with her to the security office on the first floor, and I carried Lily the whole way because I could not stand to let her walk beside me, could not risk having even a foot of distance between us. The security office was a small, windowless room behind the customer service desk, crammed with monitors showing grainy footage from cameras all over the store. The head of security was a heavy-set man named Ron with a gray mustache and kind eyes that made me feel like maybe everything was going to be okay. He sat me down in a plastic chair and handed me a bottle of water while his colleague started rewinding through the footage. Lily had stopped crying, but she would not let go of my arm, her fingers digging into my sleeve like she thought I might disappear. I watched the monitors as they scrolled backward through time, seeing myself and Lily arrive at the toy section, seeing the woman approach from somewhere off-screen. Ron asked me to walk him through what happened while they searched for the moment when the woman entered the store. I told him everything, every detail I could remember, and he wrote it all down in a little notebook with handwriting so neat it looked like a font. They found her on the footage entering through the main doors about 15 minutes before she grabbed Lily. She walked in alone, browsed through the women's clothing section for a few minutes, then made her way upstairs to toys. Ron zoomed in on her face and printed a still image, her features pixelated but recognizable, that same calm expression she had worn while trying to drag my daughter away. But then he showed me something that made the room feel like it was tilting sideways. He pulled up footage from a camera near the loading dock at the back of the store, time-stamped just 2 minutes after the woman had let go of Lily's arm. There she was, walking quickly through a door marked "Employees Only," and waiting for her in the loading area were 2 men. One was tall and thin with a shaved head, wearing a dark jacket despite the warm weather. The other was shorter, stockier, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. They were standing next to a white van with no windows in the back, the engine already running. Ron paused the footage and looked at me with an expression that confirmed everything I was already feeling. This was not some confused woman who thought Lily was her niece. This was planned, coordinated, a trap that my daughter had walked right into while I stood 10 feet away checking my phone. The woman climbed into the back of the van, and one of the men slid the door shut behind her. The van pulled out of the loading area and disappeared from the camera's view within seconds. Ron told me the police were already on their way, that they would want to see all of this footage and talk to me about what happened. I nodded, but I was not really listening anymore. I was doing the math in my head, calculating how close we had come to a completely different ending. If Lily had not screamed, if I had looked at my phone for 10 seconds instead of 5, if the woman had been just a little bit faster or a little bit stronger. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 officers in uniform and a detective in plain clothes who introduced herself as Nora Castillo. She had a calm, no-nonsense way about her that reminded me of my older sister, the way she asked questions without ever making me feel like I was being interrogated. I went through the whole story again, start to finish, while she took notes on a tablet. Lily had fallen asleep on my lap by then, exhausted from crying, her thumb in her mouth like she had not done since she was 3. Detective Castillo watched the security footage twice, pausing it in different places, zooming in on the faces of the 2 men by the van. She told me that this fit a pattern they had been tracking for months, organized groups who targeted children in public places, using women as the primary approach because they were less likely to trigger alarm. She said the phrase, "do not make a scene," was something they trained their people to say, a way of making it look like a family dispute rather than an abduction. They never caught them. Detective Castillo called me a few times over the following weeks, updating me on the investigation, but the van's plates had been stolen from a car in Delaware, and the footage was not clear enough to run through facial recognition. She told me that groups like this moved constantly, hitting different stores in different cities, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked. The woman who grabbed Lily could be anywhere by now, could be approaching another child in another toy aisle at this very moment. That thought kept me awake for months, still keeps me awake sometimes. I think about the other parents who were not as lucky as me, the ones who looked at their phones for 10 seconds instead of 5, the ones whose children did not know to scream. I think about what would have happened if that van had pulled away with my daughter inside, where she would have ended up, what they would have done to her. Those thoughts never fully go away. They just get quieter over time. Lily is 14 now, and she still will not let me out of her sight in public places. She does not remember the details of that day anymore. The memories have faded into something vague and dreamlike, but her body remembers. She gets anxious in crowds, reaches for my hand without thinking about it, always positions herself so she can see the exits. We never went back to Brennan's. It closed down a few years later anyway. But every time we pass a department store, she walks a little faster. I taught her everything Detective Castillo told me to teach her. How to scream and fight and never stop making noise. How to yell, "This is not my mom," or "I do not know this person," so bystanders understand what is happening. I check her location on my phone a dozen times a day, even though she is too old for that now. Even though she rolls her eyes every time I text to ask where she is. I know I am overprotective. I know I need to let her grow up. But I keep seeing that woman's calm face. Keep hearing those words in that steady voice. Do not make a scene. Sometimes at night, when everything is quiet and Lily is safe in her room and the house is locked up tight, I let myself feel the full weight of how close we came. And then I get up and check the locks one more time, just to be sure. Every Friday afternoon, right after the school bus dropped me off, my mom would already have my overnight bag packed and waiting by the front door. She and my dad worked double shifts at the textile factory on the edge of town, and weekends meant I stayed at Uncle Vernon's place, a crooked two-story house on Granger Road in Wilmington, North Carolina. Born in 1989, I was 9 years old during the spring of 1998, when everything changed. Vernon was my dad's younger brother, a quiet man with deep-set eyes and hands that always seemed too still. He worked from home doing something with computers, though I never understood exactly what. His house smelled like pine sol and something else underneath, something metallic that I could never quite place. He kept the curtains drawn even during the day, and the only sounds were the hum of his equipment and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Uncle Vernon had 3 rules that he repeated every single time I walked through his door. First, I could eat anything in the fridge except the items on the bottom shelf. Second, bedtime was 9 o'clock sharp, no exceptions. Third, and he always said this one slower, leaning down to meet my eyes, I was never under any circumstances to open the basement door. He told me the stairs were rotted through and dangerous, that he kept old electrical equipment down there that could hurt me. The door itself was nothing special, just a plain white door at the end of the hallway near the kitchen. But it had 3 heavy-duty locks on it. Deadbolts, the kind you see on front doors of apartments in bad neighborhoods. Even at 9 years old, I remember thinking that was strange. You do not put 3 deadbolts on a door just to protect a kid from falling down some stairs. But I was a quiet child, obedient to a fault, and Uncle Vernon was always kind to me in his distant way. He let me watch cartoons, made me grilled cheese sandwiches, and never raised his voice. So I followed his rules without question, and I never touched that door. That particular weekend started like any other. My dad dropped me off around 6 in the evening, gave me a quick hug through the car window, and drove off with a tired wave. Uncle Vernon stood on the porch wearing his usual outfit, khaki pants, a faded blue button-down shirt, and those thick glasses that made his eyes look smaller than they were. He smiled when he saw me, but his smiles never quite reached his eyes. They were more like a reflex, something he had learned to do rather than something he felt. We ate dinner together in the kitchen, microwaved lasagna and a glass of milk, while he asked me about school in that flat, distracted way of his. I told him about my spelling test and the new kid in class named Oliver who ate glue. Vernon nodded at all the right moments, but I could tell his mind was somewhere else. He kept glancing at his watch, then toward the hallway where the basement door waited in shadow. After dinner, I settled into my usual spot on the living room couch with a blanket and the remote control. Vernon had basic cable, which meant I could watch Cartoon Network until 9 o'clock. He disappeared into his office down the hall, a small room packed with computer towers and tangled wires, and I heard the familiar click of his door closing. That was normal. He always worked at night, typing away at something I was never allowed to see. Around 8:30, I heard his office door open, followed by his footsteps moving through the house. But instead of coming to check on me, the footsteps went the other direction, toward the kitchen, toward the basement. I heard the metallic scrape of locks being turned, one after another. Then the creak of a door opening, then footsteps descending stairs that were supposedly too dangerous for anyone to use. I turned the volume up on the television and pretended I had not noticed. That was what good boys did. They minded their own business and followed the rules. 9 o'clock came and Vernon reappeared from somewhere in the back of the house, his face calm and expressionless as always. He told me it was bedtime, and I did not argue. The guest room was on the second floor, a small space with yellow wallpaper and a twin bed that squeaked every time I moved. There was a window that looked out onto the backyard, but Vernon kept it locked and covered with thick curtains. He tucked me in the way he always did, mechanical, efficient, like he was following instructions from a manual. He said goodnight, turned off the lamp, and closed the door behind him. I lay there in the dark, listening to the old house settle around me. The pipes groaned, the walls creaked, and somewhere beneath me, through the floorboards and the ceiling of the first floor and whatever lay below that, I heard something else. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. A voice, muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. Someone was crying. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and squeezed my eyes shut. It is just the pipes, I told myself. Old houses make weird noises. That is what my dad always said when our own house creaked at night. But the sound continued, rising and falling in a rhythm that pipes do not make. It was a person, a young person, maybe a teenager, sobbing and short, hitching breaths like they were trying to stay quiet but could not help themselves. My heart pounded against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to call out for Uncle Vernon, but something stopped me. Some instinct buried deep in my 9-year-old brain that whispered, "Do not let him know you heard." I do not know how long I lay there, rigid under the covers, listening to that awful sound. It could have been minutes. It could have been an hour. Eventually, the crying stopped. The house went silent. And somehow, despite everything, I fell into a thin, restless sleep filled with dreams I could not remember when I woke. A noise jolted me awake sometime in the middle of the night. The room was pitch black, and for a moment I could not remember where I was. Then it came back to me. Uncle Vernon's house, the guest room, the crying from below. I held my breath and listened. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps on the first floor, directly beneath my room. Then a different sound, something being dragged across the hardwood. It was a scraping, stuttering noise, like something heavy and unwilling being pulled along the floor. I heard the basement door creak open. I heard Uncle Vernon's voice, low and calm, saying words I could not make out. And then I heard another voice, a younger voice, male, pleading in broken, desperate tones. The words were muffled through the floor, but the terror in them was unmistakable. "Please, and stop, and I want to go home." My whole body went cold. I was 9 years old and I did not fully understand what I was hearing, but I knew in some primal animal way that something very bad was happening in this house. I should have stayed in bed. I should have pulled the covers over my head and waited for morning. That is what I tell myself now, decades later, when the memories come back in the middle of the night. But I was a child, and children are curious even when they are afraid, maybe especially when they are afraid. I slipped out from under the blanket and crept toward the bedroom door, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. The door was old and heavy, and I opened it just a crack, just enough to see the staircase leading down to the first floor. The hallway below was dim, lit only by a faint glow coming from the direction of the kitchen. I could hear Uncle Vernon's voice more clearly now, that same calm, measured tone he used when he told me the rules. And I could hear the other voice too, the young one, no longer pleading but whimpering softly like an injured animal. Every instinct screamed at me to go back to bed, but my feet carried me forward anyway. I crept down the stairs one at a time, my hand gripping the railing so tight my knuckles ached. At the bottom of the stairs, I pressed myself against the wall and peered around the corner toward the kitchen. The basement door stood wide open, spilling a sickly yellow light into the hallway. And there was Uncle Vernon, his back to me, dragging someone, through that forbidden doorway. The teenager was maybe 15 or 16, with shaggy brown hair matted with sweat and dirt. His wrists were bound behind his back with gray duct tape, and there was more tape wrapped around his mouth, muffling his cries into pathetic nasal moans. His eyes were wide and red-rimmed, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He was wearing a torn green jacket and jeans that were filthy, like he had been wearing them for days, maybe weeks. Vernon pulled him by the collar with one hand, completely unbothered by the boy's thrashing, like he was hauling a bag of garbage to the curb. I stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe, watching my uncle drag a bound and beaten teenager into the basement like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Then Vernon stopped, his head tilted slightly, like a dog hearing a distant whistle. He turned around slowly, and his eyes found me standing at the bottom of the stairs in my pajamas. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The teenager on the ground went still too, his muffled cries cutting off abruptly as he followed Vernon's gaze and saw me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw something in them that I will never forget. A desperate, flickering hope, like he thought maybe I could save him. Then Vernon smiled. It was not the mechanical smile I was used to. This one was different. Warmer, almost. Like he was genuinely pleased to see me. He released the teenager's collar and straightened up, brushing off his hands on his khaki pants. "Hey, buddy," he said in that same calm voice. "Go back to bed. You did not see anything." He said it like he was reminding me to brush my teeth. Casual, friendly, like we were having a perfectly normal conversation in the middle of a perfectly normal night. I ran. I do not remember making the decision to run. My body just moved on its own, turning and scrambling back up the stairs on all fours like a frightened animal. I heard Vernon call after me, still calm, still friendly. "It is okay, buddy. Everything is okay. Just go back to sleep." I did not stop. I burst into the guest room and dove under the covers, pulling the blanket over my head and curling into the tightest ball I could manage. My chest heaved. My whole body trembled. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed my palms over my ears, trying to block out the world, trying to pretend I was somewhere else. Anywhere else. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow. Unhurried. Then they stopped outside my door. The handle turned. The door creaked open. I felt Vernon's presence in the room, standing there in the darkness, watching me. Neither of us spoke. After what felt like an eternity, the door clicked shut again. The footsteps retreated down the stairs. And I lay there, shaking, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the curtains. When morning came, Vernon acted like nothing had happened. He made me scrambled eggs and toast, humming softly to himself while he cooked. The basement door was closed and locked, all 3 deadbolts firmly in place. The hallway floor was spotless. No scuff marks, no dirt, no sign that anyone had been dragged across it just hours before. Vernon asked me if I slept well, and I nodded because I did not trust my voice. He smiled that mechanical smile and told me my dad would be picking me up around noon. I sat at the kitchen table and ate my eggs in silence, my eyes fixed on my plate, terrified to look anywhere else. The house smelled like pine sol again, stronger than usual, like Vernon had been cleaning all night. When my dad arrived, I ran to the car without looking back. I climbed into the back seat and stared out the window as we drove away, watching Uncle Vernon wave from the porch, his hand moving slowly back and forth like a metronome. I never told my parents what I saw. I was 9 years old, and I did not have the words. And part of me, a bigger part than I want to admit, was afraid that if I said anything, Vernon would know. Vernon would find out. Vernon would come for me. After that weekend, I refused to go back to Uncle Vernon's house. I threw tantrums, faked sickness, did everything a 9-year-old could do to avoid being left there again. My parents thought I was just being difficult, going through a phase, my mom called it. They tried to force the issue a few times, but I screamed and cried so hard that eventually they gave up, and found a neighbor lady to watch me instead. Vernon came to our house for Thanksgiving that year, and I locked myself in my room and refused to come out until he left. My dad was furious with me, said I was being disrespectful to family. I took the punishment, no television for a week, without complaint. It was worth it. Anything was worth it to never be alone with Vernon again. Over the years, I saw him less and less. He moved away when I was 12 somewhere out west, and the family lost touch. I grew up, went to college, got a job, built a life. I buried that night so deep I almost convinced myself it had been a nightmare. Almost. Then, 15 years later, I saw his face on the evening news. Vernon Caldwell, 53 years old, arrested in Albuquerque, New Mexico for the kidnapping and imprisonment of 2 teenage boys. The police had found them in a soundproofed room beneath his garage, malnourished and terrified, but alive. The news anchor said Vernon had been linked to at least 4 other missing persons cases across 3 states, dating back over 2 decades. They showed his mugshot, older now, grayer, but with those same deep-set eyes and that same flat expression. I sat on my couch and stared at the screen, and suddenly I was 9 years old again, standing at the bottom of those stairs, watching my uncle drag a bound teenager into the darkness. I thought about the boy in the green jacket, the one whose eyes had begged me for help. I never found out what happened to him. I looked through every article, every court document I could find, but his name was never mentioned. Maybe he escaped. Maybe Vernon let him go. Or maybe he is still down there somewhere, in a basement I never had the courage to report, buried beneath a house that was torn down years ago. I will never know. And I think that is the part that haunts me most, not what I saw, but what I did not do. I was just a kid. I know that. But some nights when the house is quiet and the memories come flooding back, I still hear that muffled crying through the floorboards. And I wonder if things might have been different, if I had just found the words to speak. Seventh grade was the year I learned what real fear feels like. Not the kind you get from horror movies or haunted houses at the fair, but the deep, paralyzing kind that starts in your chest and spreads through your whole body until you cannot breathe. It was a Friday in March 2014, and I had been running a fever all night, so my mom finally let me stay home from school. We lived in a quiet suburb outside of Baltimore, on a street called Ashford Circle where nothing interesting ever happened. My dad worked as an accountant and left the house around 6 every morning. My mom was a nurse at a hospital 20 minutes away, and her shift started at 7:30. Before she left, she stuck a yellow note on the refrigerator with her neat handwriting. "Take your medicine at noon, drink fluids. Do not answer the door for anyone. Call me if anything happens." I barely glanced at it. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where people left their cars unlocked, and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. The idea that something bad could happen there seemed almost ridiculous. The morning went by slowly, the way sick days always do. I watched cartoons for a while, then switched to some action movie on cable that I had already seen twice before. My throat hurt and my head felt stuffed with cotton, but it was manageable. My older sister Natalie was away at college in Virginia, so I had the whole house to myself, which felt like a rare kind of freedom. Around 11, I heated up leftover chicken soup and ate it on the living room couch, something my mom never allowed when she was home. Outside, the sky was a flat, heavy gray, the kind that makes everything feel muted and still. I looked out the front window at some point and noticed how empty the street was. All the neighbors were at work, all the kids at school. The only movement was a single crow hopping across the Delgado family lawn 3 houses down. For the first time that morning, the silence in the house started to feel less comfortable and more like something pressing against my ears. It was around 12:30 when I first heard it. I had just taken my medicine and was walking back to the couch when there was a sound at the front door. Not a knock exactly, but more like someone testing the handle, turning it slowly back and forth. My first thought was that maybe my mom had come home early to check on me, but that did not make sense because she always used the garage door. I stood in the hallway, frozen mid-step, and listened. The handle moved again, a soft metallic rattling that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet house. Then it stopped. I figured it was probably a delivery driver who got confused when no one answered, maybe leaving a package on the porch. We got stuff from online orders all the time. I almost walked to the door to check, but something made me hesitate. Instead, I stayed where I was and waited. About 30 seconds later, I heard footsteps moving along the side of the house, crunching softly on the dead leaves that had piled up against the foundation over the winter. They were heading toward the back. Told myself it was nothing. Maybe a meter reader from the electric company, or a neighbor looking for their dog. There were 100 explanations that made sense, and I cycled through all of them as I stood there in my pajamas with my heart beating just a little faster than normal. The footsteps stopped somewhere near the back of the house, and then I heard a new sound, a soft tapping on glass. It was coming from the kitchen window, the one above the sink that looked out onto our small backyard. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone testing how solid it was. I crept toward the kitchen doorway and peered around the corner, but from that angle I could not see the window properly. The tapping stopped, and for a moment everything was quiet again. Then the footsteps resumed, moving further along the back of the house toward my parents' bedroom on the other side. I heard another window being tested, this one with more force, a pushing and rattling sound that made my stomach tighten into a hard knot. I should have called my mom right then. I should have called 911. But my 12-year-old brain was still trying to convince itself that this was normal, that there was some reasonable explanation I just was not seeing. Maybe it was a maintenance worker my parents had scheduled and forgotten to tell me about. Maybe it was someone from the homeowners association checking something on the exterior. I stood in the hallway, barely breathing, and listened as the footsteps circled back toward the front of the house. For a few seconds, I thought whoever it was had given up and left. The silence stretched out, and I started to relax just a little, letting out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. Then I heard a new sound coming from the living room, a slow, deliberate scraping noise that made every hair on my arms stand up. It was metal against metal, a grinding and prying sound that I could not immediately identify. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move toward the living room entrance, staying close to the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. What I saw when I peeked around the corner is something I will never forget as long as I live. There was a man crouched outside the large window that faced our front yard, the one with the broken lock my dad had been meaning to fix for months. He was using a flathead screwdriver to pry at the window frame, working it back and forth with practiced movements like he had done this 100 times before. The man looked like he was in his 40s, with thinning brown hair and a red jacket that had some kind of logo on the chest I could not make out. His face was completely calm, focused, like he was just doing a regular job. Not rushed, not nervous, just methodical. I pulled back from the doorway so fast I almost tripped over my own feet. My heart was slamming against my ribs now, and I could feel the fever sweat mixing with a cold, different kind of sweat that was breaking out all over my body. This was not a delivery driver. This was not a maintenance worker. Someone was breaking into my house, and I was the only one home. I moved without thinking, pure instinct taking over. There was a hallway closet about 10 feet from where I stood, the one where we kept winter coats and old board games and boxes of stuff we never used. I opened the door as quietly as I could, slipped inside and pulled it shut behind me, leaving it open just a crack so it would not make that clicking sound. The closet was dark and smelled like mothballs and dust. I pressed myself into the far corner, behind a thick wool coat that had belonged to my grandfather before he died, and I pulled out my phone. My fingers were trembling so badly that I almost dropped it twice. I could not call 911 because I was terrified that I would have to speak, and if I spoke, he would hear me. So I called my mom instead and pressed the phone to my ear, praying she would pick up. It rang 4 times, and each ring felt like an eternity. I heard a loud cracking sound from the living room, the sound of wood splintering, and I knew he was inside. My mom answered just as I heard the window sliding open, and I whispered so quietly I was not even sure she could hear me. "Mom, there is a man in the house." The next few minutes were the longest of my entire life. My mom kept her voice calm even though I could hear the panic underneath it. and she told me to stay exactly where I was. Do not move, do not make any sound. She was calling 911 on the office phone right now. I heard the man step through the window and land on our living room floor with a soft thud. His footsteps were slow and deliberate on the hardwood, moving through the room like he had all the time in the world. Then he started talking, and that was the part that made me want to scream. His voice was casual, almost friendly, like he was calling out to a neighbor. "I know someone is home," he said. "I saw you through the window earlier. Just come out and we can talk. No reason to hide." The closet suddenly felt like the worst hiding spot in the world. It was so obvious, so predictable. I pressed my hand over my mouth and tried to control my breathing, but my whole body was shaking. My mom was whispering in my ear, telling me the police were on their way, telling me to stay quiet, telling me I was going to be okay. I wanted to believe her, but I could hear the man walking down the hallway now, opening doors one by one. He checked the bathroom first. I heard the shower curtain being pulled back, the metal rings scraping against the rod. Then he moved to my sister Natalie's old room, and I heard him open her closet, push some things around, close it again. "Come on, buddy," he called out, his voice getting closer. "I am not going to hurt you. I just want to talk. Your parents are not here. It is just us." There was something in the way he said it that made my skin go cold, a kind of practiced reassurance that felt rehearsed, like lines from a script he had used before. My mom was still on the phone, and I could hear her crying now, telling me she loved me, telling me to hold on. The police were almost there. The man's footsteps stopped right outside the hallway closet. I could see the shadow of his feet through the crack at the bottom of the door, two dark shapes blocking the thin strip of light. My lungs were burning because I had been holding my breath without realizing it. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed myself deeper into the corner, behind the coats, making myself as small as humanly possible. I heard him put his hand on the doorknob. I heard it start to turn. And then, like some kind of miracle, the sirens came. They were distant at first, just a faint wailing sound somewhere in the neighborhood, but they got louder fast. The man stopped turning the knob. I heard him mutter something under his breath, a single word I could not make out. The shadow of his feet disappeared from under the door, and his footsteps moved quickly back down the hallway toward the living room. I heard him climb back through the window, heard his feet hit the ground outside, and then nothing. Just the sirens getting closer and closer until they seemed to be right outside our house. I stayed in that closet. I did not move. Even when I heard car doors slamming and voices shouting and someone pounding on our front door announcing they were police, I could not make my body respond. My mom was screaming my name through the phone now, asking if I was okay, begging me to answer. I finally managed to whisper, "He is gone," and then I started crying so hard I could barely breathe. The police had to coax me out of that closet. One of them, a woman with short gray hair and kind eyes, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and told me I did everything right, that I was so brave. I did not feel brave. I felt like I was going to throw up. My mom made it home in 15 minutes, a drive that usually took her at least 25. She ran through the front door and grabbed me so hard I thought she might crack my ribs, and she did not let go for a long time. My dad came home from work right after, his face pale and his tie loosened like he had been pulling at it the whole drive. The police asked me questions for what felt like hours, and I told them everything I could remember. The red jacket, the thinning hair, the screwdriver, the way he talked like we were old friends. They dusted for fingerprints and took photographs of the damaged window frame. A detective named Rourke, a tall man with a thick mustache and a voice like gravel, told my parents they would do everything they could to find the guy. But it was what they found on our security cameras that really changed everything. My dad had installed a basic system the year before, just 2 cameras covering the driveway and the front porch. When the police reviewed the footage, they did not just find the break-in. They found weeks of recordings showing the same man in the red jacket walking past our house, sometimes slowly, sometimes stopping to look. He appeared on camera 14 different times over the span of 3 weeks, always during school hours, always when both cars were gone from the driveway. He had been watching us. He had been waiting. They caught him 6 days later. His name was Ronald Weber. 44 years old, and he lived in an apartment complex about 8 miles from our neighborhood. He had 2 prior convictions for burglary and 1 for assault. The police told my parents that guys like him specifically target houses where they think only children are home because kids are less likely to fight back and more likely to hide. He had apparently done this before in other neighborhoods, other towns, always picking sick days or half days when a child might be alone. I do not know what he would have done if those sirens had come 30 seconds later, if his hand had finished turning that doorknob. I try not to think about it, but sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep, my mind goes there anyway. We moved to a different house the following summer, one with a better security system and stronger locks and no windows that a screwdriver could pry open. I am 23 now, finishing up graduate school in Boston, and I still check every lock twice before I go to bed. I still feel my chest tighten when I hear unexpected footsteps outside. Some fears do not go away just because you survive them. They just become part of who you are. Back when I was a kid, my world revolved around the little playground a few blocks from home. My mom worked double shifts most days, so my older brother, Mark, was usually the one keeping an eye on me, even though he was only 12 at the time. I remember that afternoon being warm enough for the metal slide to sting the backs of my legs, and the air had that dusty smell the park always got when groups of kids had been running around for hours. I'd been trying to braid dandelion stems into a crown, something I'd seen older girls do, when a man I recognized from the community center walked by the swings and called my name like he already knew me. He was the type of person adults seem to trust without thinking twice. Everyone knew he helped with weekend events, handing out snacks and picking up trash with a pair of rubber gloves he kept tucked into his back pocket. He had this habit of leaning forward when he talked, like he genuinely wanted to hear every word you said. I remember noticing his watch that day. Thick leather band, scratched face, one of the numbers missing. For some reason I thought it looked important, the kind of thing grown-ups wore when they had someplace serious to be. He asked where Mark was, and I told him my brother had gone a few streets over with his friends, promising he'd be back in a little while. The man nodded like this was completely expected, and then said he needed help with something important for the center. I didn't understand much at that age, just that adults liked when kids helped out, and I always wanted to be one of the helpful ones. He mentioned a small storeroom behind the park where they kept supplies for the weekend activities. Chalk, signs, old folding chairs. I remember feeling oddly proud that he'd asked me specifically, like I'd been trusted with some kind of little mission. When we reached the back of the park, I noticed the door blended into the walls so well it looked almost hidden. He unlocked it with a key he kept on a long cord around his neck, and I followed him inside without thinking. The room smelled like old cardboard and warm plastic, and there was a single bulb buzzing above us, flickering just enough to make the shadows shift on the floor. Before I could even ask what he needed help with, the door clicked behind me, and he turned the lock with a movement so casual it didn't register as wrong until he positioned himself between me and the way out. The shift in his behavior was subtle, but even at 6, I could tell something wasn't right. He started talking in this slow, drawn-out way, asking if anyone ever told me how grown-up I seemed. I remember staring at the floor, tracing the shape of a dent in the concrete with my shoe, because looking at him suddenly felt uncomfortable. He moved closer, not touching me, but close enough that the air felt too crowded for such a small room. His voice dropped lower, almost like he didn't want anyone outside to hear, and he kept making comments that didn't sound like the things adults usually said to kids. The bulb above us flickered again, and without warning, he rested his hand on the metal shelf beside me, trapping me between the crates and his arm. I didn't understand the meaning behind his gestures, but I knew I didn't like it. He asked if I wanted to see something special he'd set aside just for me, and the way he said it made me step back until my shoulders touched the cold wall. He watched me with this strange, fixed expression, like he wasn't seeing me as a person anymore, but something else he thought he had control over. Before he could say anything else, there was a sudden echo of footsteps outside, fast, uneven, and getting closer. Then Mark's voice broke through the silence, sharper than I'd ever heard it. He was calling my name over and over, and behind him I heard the voices of his friends, all of them sounding out of breath and angry. They must have realized I'd wandered off longer than usual, because the next thing I remember is the sound of fists hitting the door, not just knocking but slamming hard enough to rattle the hinges. The man jerked backward like someone had yanked a string attached to his spine. His face went pale, and he whispered something under his breath before fumbling with the lock. The pounding outside only got louder, echoing through the small space, and for a moment I honestly thought the door might break open. When he finally twisted the key, he pulled the door open just a crack and muttered for me to go quickly, like he knew there was no way to talk his way out of what was happening. I slipped past him, my legs stiff and shaky, and ran straight into Mark's arms. Mark didn't let go of me right away. He kept one arm around my shoulders while grilling the man with questions, demanding to know why I'd been in there with him and why the door was locked. His friends stood behind him, tense and ready to jump in if anything happened. The man tried to act calm, adjusting the cord of his key and insisting it was a misunderstanding, that he'd only been showing me where they kept supplies. But his voice shook just enough for even a kid to notice, and he wouldn't look any of them directly in the eye. One of Mark's friends, Tyler, pointed out that adults didn't usually give private tours to little kids in rooms with no windows. Another said he'd seen us walk toward the back of the park and thought it was weird. The man stepped away from the door as if putting distance between us would somehow erase what he'd done. I remember staring at the ground, too overwhelmed to process anything except the relief of being outside that room again. Mark kept me close, shielding me in that protective way older siblings sometimes have even when they're scared themselves. When we got home, Mark told our mom everything before I even had the chance to speak. She didn't yell or panic the way I expected. She just listened, her hands still, her face tight with anger she didn't want me to see. The next morning she went to the community center and spoke with someone in charge. I wasn't in the room, but I could hear the edge in her voice through the thin office walls. Whatever she said must have hit hard, because 2 days later the man wasn't around anymore. His name was taken off the volunteer board, and no one seemed to know where he'd gone. As a kid, I assumed adults handled everything behind the scenes, and that was the end of it. But now looking back, I realize how close things came to becoming something much darker. Sometimes when I think about it, I picture that dim room with the buzzing light and the way he stood between me and the door. Then I think about Mark, 12 years old, sprinting across the playground because he realized his little sister had been gone too long. If he and his friends hadn't shown up when they did, I genuinely don't know what would have happened. All I know is he disappeared from our neighborhood after that day, and no one ever spoke his name again. When I think back to that night, I still remember how excited I'd been just to be there. I was 10, and staying over at my friend Lucas's house felt like stepping into a world that wasn't mine. Different smells, different routines. Even the way his mom stacked the cereal boxes felt unfamiliar in a good way. I'd known Lucas from school, but this was the first time our parents agreed to let me sleep over. We spent the whole afternoon playing video games in his room, eating microwave popcorn his mom made, and arguing about which monster was scarier in a movie we definitely weren't supposed to watch. By the time we settled down for bed, the house felt comfortable enough that I didn't think twice about being away from home. Lucas slept in this wooden twin bed that creaked every time he moved, and I had a sleeping bag laid out on a rug with little planets printed all over it. His room wasn't big, but it felt cozy. There was a nightlight shaped like a baseball on his dresser, casting this warm, soft glow across the walls. I remember lying there, listening to the distant hum of the fridge downstairs and the occasional passing car outside. For a while, nothing felt strange at all. It was the kind of night that should have been easy, the kind where a kid just drifts off without thinking about anything scary. Sometime in the middle of the night, I snapped awake without knowing why. It wasn't from a nightmare, and it wasn't a noise. Not at first. It was just that weird shift when your mind suddenly flicks back on. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light in the room. Lucas was turned toward the wall, breathing slow and steady. I remember staring at his baseball nightlight, expecting everything to look the same as when we'd fallen asleep. For a minute it did. Then I heard the faintest sound, metal rubbing gently against metal, like someone easing down a door handle. The bedroom door opened just a sliver at first, barely enough to change the shape of the shadows. I assumed it was Lucas's mom checking on us. That seemed normal, so I kept my eyes mostly shut, trying to look asleep. But the door kept opening, slow and deliberate, and something about the rhythm of it felt wrong. When it finally widened enough for me to see the shape standing there, the breath caught in my throat. It wasn't Lucas's mom. The silhouette filling the doorway was much taller, with broad shoulders and the kind of stillness adults don't usually have when they're half asleep and checking on kids. He didn't move for several seconds, just watched us, like he was deciding something. Only then did I realize I didn't recognize him at all. He stepped into the room with this strange calm, like he'd done it before. The nightlight barely reached him, but I could make out enough to know he wasn't anyone I'd seen around their house earlier. His clothes looked dark, and his posture didn't match the relaxed way Lucas's dad carried himself when he'd said goodnight hours earlier. The man moved closer to the bed, and I could hear him breathing. Slow, steady, too controlled. He leaned toward Lucas and whispered something, a short string of words I couldn't make out, like he was speaking through clenched teeth. Lucas didn't respond, didn't stir at all. His stillness made everything feel even stranger. The man leaned in again, whispering deeper this time as if expecting an answer that never came. I kept my face angled toward the wall, pretending to sleep but watching him through the smallest slit of vision I could get away with. The man straightened up and turned his attention toward me. I didn't know why at the time, but the way he shifted his weight felt intentional, almost rehearsed. He walked slowly across the room, his shoes making barely any sound against the carpet. I could smell something faint on him, like old cologne mixed with damp fabric. He crouched next to my sleeping bag, close enough that I could see the outline of his knees pressing into the rug. I didn't dare breathe too deeply. I focused on keeping my chest rising in the same soft rhythm as before, terrified he'd notice any change. He stayed crouched there longer than felt human. I didn't hear him whisper anything to me, but I could sense him examining me, the way someone sizes up a photograph or a locked door. I kept waiting for him to touch my shoulder or shake me awake, but he didn't. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to study my face in the low light. At that moment, every instinct I had screamed to bolt out of that sleeping bag, but I knew any sudden move might bring his full attention onto me in a way I couldn't handle. The seconds stretched out so far, they barely felt real. When he finally shifted back, I took it as my only chance. I waited for the soft creak his knees made as he stood, quiet, but enough for me to know he wasn't hovering over me anymore. Without lifting my head, I slowly inched my hand toward the edge of the sleeping bag, gathering the fabric just enough so it wouldn't drag loudly when I got up. Lucas's bed made its usual little groan as he breathed, which gave me a tiny bit of ambient noise to mask my own movements. I eased myself upward, keeping my steps feather-light as I backed away from the man's shadow. The door was only a few feet away, but it felt like crossing a football field. Once I slipped through the doorway, I didn't stop. I walked down the hallway on my toes until I reached the coat closet near the stairs and tucked myself inside, pulling the door closed just enough to leave a narrow gap for air. Inside that closet, every sound in the house seemed 10 times louder. I could hear the faint tick of a wall clock downstairs and the occasional pop from the heating system, but none of it masked the noise I dreaded most: footsteps moving slowly across the hallway carpet. They weren't rushed or confused. They moved with a steady rhythm, like someone who knew exactly where each board of the floor was and which ones wouldn't creak. I kept my eye close to the thin line of space between the door and the frame, trying to catch any sign of movement. At one point, a shadow glided across the opposite wall, long, slanted, unmistakably human. I pressed myself deeper between a winter coat and a stack of shoeboxes, hoping the narrow space would muffle any tiny sound I made. Minutes dragged into what felt like an hour. Every now and then the house settled, making soft groans that made my throat tighten. I thought about waking Lucas or calling for his parents, but the man's calm presence in the room earlier told me he wasn't afraid of being discovered. It felt safer to stay hidden than to risk crossing the hallway again. My legs grew stiff from being curled up, and the coats brushed against my face with every nervous breath I let out, carrying smells of fabric softener and cold dust. I kept picturing Lucas still asleep in that room with the nightlight casting its weak glow, unaware of the figure that had stood inches from him. Eventually, the footsteps faded, replaced by a heavy silence that didn't feel reassuring. It was the kind of quiet that makes you question if someone is standing still nearby, waiting. I stayed exactly where I was, keeping count in my head to distract myself. When I reached what I guessed might have been 30 minutes, I considered peeking out again, but my fear of that tall shadow reappearing held me still. Around that time, a distant sound reached me, the soft rumble of a car passing on the street outside. That little reminder of the outside world made me feel like morning wasn't impossibly far away. Still, I didn't leave the closet until I saw the first sliver of daylight creeping under the hallway trim. When the sun finally softened the corners of the house, I eased the door open and stepped out, legs tingling with pins of numbness. The hallway looked ordinary again, almost disappointingly normal. I walked back to Lucas's room, expecting chaos, tossed blankets, open drawers, something. But nothing was out of place. Lucas was still asleep, curled toward the wall, his breathing as steady as it had been hours earlier. I checked the rest of the house quietly. Kitchen empty, living room untouched, front door still locked. When Lucas's mom eventually came downstairs and found me sitting at the dining table, she looked confused when I asked if anyone else had been home. Her answer was so confident, so casual, that it didn't fit at all with what I'd seen. She said only the three of them lived there, and no one had visited that night. She even smiled gently, assuming I'd had a bad dream. That morning, I didn't know how to push back or explain it in a way an adult would believe. I just nodded and gathered my things, waiting for my parents to pick me up. Lucas woke up cheerful, completely unaware anything strange had happened. I watched him eat his cereal like nothing in his world had shifted overnight. To this day, I've never figured out who that man was or why